Okay, let's do this. In 2008, Kick-Ass seemed destined to become the next big thing. Achieving records for an independent comic, multiple printings, glowing reviews, and even securing a movie deal before it ever hit the shelves. It had sequels, adaptations, spin-offs, relaunches, and even a multiversal event. So it seemed like Kick-Ass had everything, but then the question is, why does it have nothing now?
Woof woof.
Hey guys, it's me Marcus aka the Mad Dog, and this is the meteoric rise and bizarre downfall of Kick-Ass. We're looking at everything, the complete story, leaving no stone unturned, going all the way back to a time when Kick-Ass wasn't even an idea. So if you compare with the fact that this is going to be my voice, then strap in because this is going to be a bit of a journey. 2008 was a huge year for Mark Millar, the Scottish-born comic writer who had previously made a name for himself on titles like The Authority, Fantastic Four, and The Ultimates, and was coming off being the lead of the big Marvel crossover Civil War, was now one of the biggest names in the industry. But that wasn't why 2008 was set to be huge for Millar. Wanted, a series Millar previously wrote for independent publisher Top Cow, was getting an adaptation with a decent budget of $75 million, and starring big names like Angelina Jolie, Morgan Freeman, and the then relatively unknown James McAvoy. But that still isn't the main reason why 2008 was Mark's year, as the first issue of a series Millar had been envisioning for years came to fruition and would be an unprecedented success that he hadn't yet experienced in his non-Marvel work. And that book, if you couldn't guess from the title of this video, was Kick-Ass. But let's dial back the clock a bit and figure out what led Millar towards comics and how his unique perspective was the perfect launchpad for Kick-Ass's success. And let's be honest, Mark couldn't have had a better inspiration to become a comics writer, as he fell in love with the idea after meeting and speaking with Alan Moore during the late 1980s. And for context, that was peak Alan Moore, coming off the success of Swamp Thing, V for Vendetta, and of course Watchmen. In addition to this, a chance interview with Grant Morrison also directed Millar towards focusing heavily on comics over other creative avenues. A medium that had previously been dominated by American writers was having its doors kicked down by a new wave from the United Kingdom, and Mark wanted in. Millar's first writing credit came at the age of 19, on a book called Savior from Trident Comics, and was already planting the seeds for the themes he'd become known for. It ran for 6 issues until the publisher became bankrupt and toyed with ideas like satire, abstract looks at real-world topics, and had that textbook Millar level of absurd violence. However, Millar initially went on to pursue a degree at the University of Glasgow in politics and economics, and had to put his dreams of writing comics on the back burner. This was until his father unfortunately passed away, and meant he couldn't afford the living expenses of being a full-time student. Desperate for work, he took on a few gigs on British publications like Sonic the Comic, Crisis, and probably his most beneficial work over at 2008D. Here is where he'd get to work with Grant Morrison on a controversial title called Big Dave, which just highlighted early on that Millar wasn't afraid of taking risks or facing backlash. But the project was successful enough to catch the attention of DC Comics, and Mark teamed up with Morrison once again, but this time to work on Swamp Thing. Despite the poor sales figures leading to the title's cancellation, he'd made enough of a good impression to co-write on big titles such as JLA, The Flash, and collaborated with Morrison, Wade, and Tom Payer to develop a radical new approach for the mainline Superman that was due to be launched in January of 2000. But prior to being released, the idea was scrapped by then editor Mike Carlin, who was unhappy with such huge changes for a flagship character. This was probably the first major dent in the armor that would lead Mark in his journey towards Kick-Ass. However, not working on the mainline Superman book didn't stop his momentum, as his star was continuing to grow on his big break when he followed Warren Ellis's run on The Authority. But here is where that rebellious streak of his kicked in again. In spite of the book being under the Wildstorm imprint, DC still had the final say on what ended up on shelves. And in the wake of 9/11, they wanted to tone down the destruction and violence which was on display, but this is kind of Millar's bread and butter in his stories. This caused friction between Millar and DC, especially with publisher Paul Levitz, and led to Millar leaving DC for Marvel, and hitting the ground running with Ultimate X-Men, the new reimagining of the mutant side of the Marvel universe for a modern audience. It was edgy, subverting expectations, and positioned Millar as one of those guys that people needed to pay attention to. He followed this up with another huge win in The Ultimates, which despite a lot of cannibalism themes, which I mentioned in my Marvel Iceberg video, was a great reimagining of the Avengers for a new generation, although it does have its detractors that won't hesitate to tell you that you're wrong for enjoying it. And Millar worked on a steady amount of titles in his years over at Marvel on the likes of Fantastic Four, Marvel Knights Spider-Man, and Trouble, but that doesn't really help the picture I'm trying to paint here, so let's instead focus on his creation of the Old Man Logan universe, the Marvel Zombieverse, and the huge company-wide crossover Civil War. But interestingly, it was during this time that Millar was pushing the boat out, and sowing the seeds that would eventually lead him directly into the path of Kick-Ass. In 2003, whilst working for Marvel, Millar wrote Wanted, a 6-issue series from Top Cow Productions that followed a fraternity of supervillains that led a revolution against the superheroes of that universe in the 80s and won. It was crass, bold, and clearly has Eminem and Halle Berry as the main characters, but it was the exact right amount of outlandish that made it stand out. It was clear that Millar was trying to subvert the genre in a way that he couldn't at Marvel or DC, and shortly after the final issue, the stick of dynamite was lit when Universal bought the movie rights to Wanted. Now, I can't find a concrete number, and trust me, I checked for 5 whole minutes. But as Top Cow was a studio of Image Comics founder Mark Silvestri, it would have likely believed in the same core principles, meaning that Millar retained ownership of his property. So when the rights were purchased by Universal in 2004, it would have been far more beneficial for Millar financially than if it was a storyline in one of his Marvel jobs. It's no secret that Marvel has ticked off creators for the way they've been credited or the lack of control they've had when a character or storyline they've made has hit it big time. Just look at Brubaker's comments following the Winter Soldier's introduction into the MCU, Todd McFarlane's legal battle over Angela. Why did it make it sound like he's fighting for custody? Jim Starlin expressing his anger at the importance of Thanos and the lack of compensation, or even Steve Englehart's thoughts at the portrayal of Mantis in Guardians of the Galaxy. Millar, being a creator who'd already made moves within the industry where he felt restricted, wasn't likely to want all of his properties locked behind the control of Marvel. Enter Icon Comics, a subdivision of Marvel that honestly feels like their response to Image so that they didn't lose any of their biggest creators who wanted to follow the passion projects. So when Ed Brubaker did Captain America for Marvel, he also had Criminal at Icon. When Bendis took over the Avengers, he carried on Powers under Icon, and it was the ideal middle ground for Millar, so that he had all the benefits he'd experienced under Top Cow, but with the publishing powerhouse that helped him bring Civil War to the masses. And with this perfect medley of all the benefits Millar had grown to appreciate so far in his comic writing journey, he wanted his first title to be something special, generational, a book that could bring together indie audiences and superhero fans, whilst also ensuring that Millar owned all that he created. So in February 2008, he gave the world Kick-Ass is the origin story of Dave Lizewski, a teenager in high school whose last name I won't try to pronounce again because I'm certain I got it wrong. He ticks all the boxes of the classic superhero, unremarkable, grieving the loss of a parent, and by all definitions is a loser. But his years of comic consumption has led to him daring to do more, to be more, and go from just being a fan to the vigilante known as Kick-Ass. Now, let's make one thing clear, this book is of a time, and that isn't automatically an insult, but it's the best way of describing Kick-Ass. Would it survive in today's landscape? I don't know, but at the same time that's why it worked on release, because it's so firmly set in the late 2000s that it felt relevant. But it is a double-edged sword because now the book becomes a snapshot into this era that I hadn't noticed was firmly behind us. It's committed to its setting, which is part of the charm, with elements like the American Pie-esque banter between Dave and his friends, and the fact that we open on not one, but 2 fake-out flash-forwards. It's not constantly subverting cliches which people tend to think of when they remember Kick-Ass, but instead it's leaning into them so that when it does switch it up, it hits twice as hard. And when this does happen, it no longer feels like a writing cliche, but just a fact of life. Seeing someone don a winged costume atop the tallest building only to plummet to the death, followed by a bloodied kid in a green ski outfit, is enough to signify that Millar favours the reality over the spectacle of the superhero. But what it does borrow from the genre, I love. Although yes, this is just chapter 1 in Kick-Ass's journey, you get a complete story in the first issue. It doesn't take a whole arc for Dave to put on a costume, and the breakneck pace helped all facets of what Millar was bringing to the table. Take Dave for example. If this opening story was dragged out, his self-aware cynicism and nods to the audience would have far outstayed the welcome. Instead, he hits the right balance of annoying, something that I myself am still working on. He's so honest and pure in his intentions that it's hard not to root for him. This might be my naivety speaking, but at the time when this was coming out, the overly self-referential satire approach didn't feel like it was the norm, so Dave comes across earnest and raw. We see a standard Dave for Dave as he goes through the humdrum of school, friendship and home life. All the while he ponders becoming a superhero. He doesn't have a dramatic origin story, and this is where Millar really begins to toy with the cliches. His mom died, but not in a dramatic mugging, but because sometimes people die. He has a crush on a girl, but he's too creepy in his approach to stand a chance, and he wanks off at the thought of his teacher because, let's be honest, he's a teenage boy. Did Stan Lee really want us to believe that Peter Parker never jerked him? The idea of saving the day consumes his thoughts, to the point he's already got a costume and plotting his first night of crime fighting whilst we're still learning how to say his surname. And I just love how honest this is in the commitment to its concept. There's no grand debut as soon as he puts on the suit. Weeks go by for him where nothing happens, and when he does finally have some thugs to confront, he's brutally beaten, stabbed, and run over. And the flow has been so well paced that having pages to linger on this beating is a sudden crash to reality. And you know what? It's easy to see why this gained attention. The promise that was here garnered rave reviews and decent sales for an indie project. Although it was a personal best for Icon Comics with nearly 50,000 units shipping and multiple printings ordered. So in all honesty, if I'm wondering what the hell happened to Kick-Ass, it's clear to see that at the best start possible. Millar also does a great job of carrying that momentum. He's not a one-issue wonder, and being told that Dave's recovery took months just reinforces that what we've taken for granted in regular superhero stories will have dire consequences in the Kick-Ass universe. I like how the story dictates the pace rather than it being the other way around. It's a drastic slamming on the brakes from the opening because we need to see how painful Dave's fuck-up is. And yeah, I don't really like having egg on my face, so I've avoided talking about this for so long, but this can only work because the art by John Romita Jr. is so on point. What's going on? Is everything okay? You okay? No, everything's fine. I just really like what Romita Jr. does in this book. Oh, yeah, no, I heard. I just assumed it was a distress signal. I didn't think I'd ever hear you say that. Alright then, next time. Weirdo. This is Night and Day from the Romita Jr. who was working on Wells' Spider-Man or Bendis' Superman. Characters have their own visual identity, costume designs are iconic without looking like they're a product of the 90s, and the world he brings to the page feels lived in. The brutality in the violence is a key aspect that set Kick-Ass apart, and I can't think of many other artists who could have delivered it while striking that same balance of realism and cartoonishness. So, for as much as I'm praising Millar for making an issue in a hospital have pace, Romita Jr. deserves his flowers for being able to make that visually stimulating as well. One of the only downsides to spending nearly a full issue in the hospital is it made me realise everyone talks the exact same. And I don't just mean like a New Yorker, but the conversations with the doctors are near identical to Dave's friends at school and the thugs in the alleyway. Besides Dave, there's no nuance in the voices, which makes the people feel more one-dimensional than the world that they live in. I call this the Avatar effect, and I mean the James Cameron film, not the goated cartoon. And it comes up primarily during the conversations, but Millar doesn't have a ton of finesse when it comes to the edginess. Sure, it's effective in having that initial shock factor, but it continues to the point where it feels like he's doing it for the sake of it. It's one of the elements that time hasn't been kind to, and I wonder if that's why Kick-Ass hasn't sustained the same level of popularity since his debut. Because if I'm thinking about when this came out, so much of it was iconic. The image of Dave beaten and bloodied but still standing tall in his costume is what drew me to this book. But when I read it and I realised that was Dave's second time going on the streets after months of recovery, that's when Kick-Ass became more than just a concept. Dave embodies what we expect from a superhero. He has that no-quit attitude, but the world he's in reflects ours probably more so than the Marvel or DC universe at the time. It is realistic that someone would record a street fight and upload it to YouTube, which at the time wasn't really something that comics were incorporating. It's like a slap in the face to the post-9/11 idealized New York of the Spider-Man movies, where the citizens rush in to help the hero. It's a sweet sentiment, sure, but too idyllic. And Kick-Ass is far closer to our reality. But I don't know if live by the sword, die by the sword is the right phrase, swings and roundabouts, or give with one hand, take with the other. But because Millar is so committed to grounding it in this world, it makes it really dated. I'm not saying I expected Kick-Ass to be this timeless classic or stand amongst the greats like Spider-Man and Batman, but this early on, I already suspected that a large part of the reason why Kick-Ass faded away is because it's stuck knee-deep in its time. It's inescapable, beyond just the dialogue. Because Dave goes viral on YouTube with the old layout and everything, but is considered a worldwide success because the video got 10,000 views. Nowadays, I would barely make any money with ad revenue, but the one that really made me cringe and feel old is when Dave mentioned the Star Wars kid. There are probably people watching this video who don't even know who that is, but the problem is that these references are thrown in to try and sound relevant to when the book was coming out, rather than be a love letter to the era, and meant that the thing that helped Kick-Ass Kick-Ass stand out initially is one of the reasons it got left behind. It's a shame too, because when Kick-Ass doesn't resort to references as a humour crutch, it's actually really funny. Maybe it's because it's mocking the commonplace trends of comics, or perhaps it's because there's an almost British sitcom charm to it. Prime example, Dave's feeling himself after Kick-Ass makes the news and decides it's time for a rooftop jump, but chickens out at the last moment in a way that felt like something from the In-Betweeners. The fact that Dave's weakness is him being Dave is where the series gets to do its best work, and the way he incorporates social media to pursue his goal just adds to his character. So much so that when I was playing the Insomniac Spider-Man and it had elements like that, it just reminded me of Kick-Ass. There is that push-pull of him being out of his depth, then finding a workaround, and the reality of that comes crashing down for him when he responds to a message about Eddie Lomas, someone's bitter ex that Kick-Ass has DM'd about. His only motivation is the possibility that the messenger might be hot, but suddenly he's caught up confronting a hardened criminal with nothing but pepper spray and things go badly. Not just because he's nearly killed again, but because he's saved by Hit Girl. I know I've had some unpopular opinions over the years, but this one might be my most controversial, but I can't stand Hit Girl. She's not too bad in this first volume, and I can see why she was such a large factor in Kick-Ass's success, but she is one of those characters that massively overstays the welcome, and by the end, I honestly can't stand her. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I just wanted to forewarn you that this will be a repeated criticism the deeper into this series we go. For those who may not know, Hit Girl is a child sidekick of Big Daddy, two fellow vigilantes that have trained their whole lives to put an end to crime with little to no regard for human life. It's a fun twist on the dynamic established by Batman and Robin, and forces us to confront how absurd and disturbing this setup would be if it really existed. Big Daddy also has a far greater origin story than Dave, having been a former police officer who was targeted by crime boss John Genovese, which led to the murder of his wife. With his daughter Mindy, he vowed to take down his operation, and Dave now awkwardly finds himself caught in the middle. But what he and Mindy bring to the book is that deeper level of the rabbit hole, the realization that Dave isn't built for this. He's the main character in his story, but not theirs. And their duo does a lot of the comic tropes right that Dave has failed at so far. It works though, because it doesn't feel like it's abandoning the tone it was built on, but still keeps Dave as the same character that we first met. Honestly, when they first appeared, I thought Millar was going to do a Metal Gear Solid 2 level bait and switch, because through Big Daddy and Hit Girl, we get to see the Genovese crime family, and it's clear they're going to be the big bad of the series, and Dave just isn't as connected. It felt like the series was taking him in a different direction as well, because being Kick-Ass was finally having its advantages. Copycat heroes were popping up, the metal plates in his body after the accident meant that he didn't feel as much pain, and his childhood crush Katie is finally talking to him. Sure, it's because she thinks he's a male escort who was beaten by a client since he was found naked in the street the night he was stabbed, but in a weird way, it's quite refreshing that Dave plays along with this. Even though it's dishonest and paints him in a weaker light, but he's a teenage boy. They will often take the dumb option over the moral one, and in a bizarre way, this first book goes on its own journey of identity. As Red Mist arrives on the scene, another vigilante but with a badass car, and immediately receives more praise than Kick-Ass. The anger Dave feels posits the question of why is he really doing this? Is it to bring the idea of a superhero into the real world, or is it for the validation that he never received as Dave? And I think Millar poses it's for the latter, when in reality it's the former. When he meets Red Mist and the two team up, they find a burning building, and Dave is the only one willing to put everything on the line to save a litter of cats, which in my eyes is the most heroic thing a person can do. If Dave was just doing this for the accolades, he'd have chickened out like Red Mist did. And I like how Dave is quite a layered character, and at the same time, his pure intentions are always what gets him into trouble. It's no secret now that Red Mist was a part of the Genovese operation, but the reveal still hits like a sledgehammer. But for as shocking as it is, the least shocking thing about it is how grotesque it forced itself to be. Sure, I did praise the violence early on, but the longer the story went on and we had to deal with the electrocution torture teased at the beginning, the up-close bullet through Big Daddy's brain, and the apparent death of Hit Girl all taking place in the same issue, just reiterated Dave's trying too hard to be brutal and edgy, as if the only motivation was to see how far they could take it, rather than be violent in service of the story. I don't know if this is Millar trying to parody how dark and edgy everything was going at the time, or if this is genuinely what he believed attempting to be a superhero would be like. But it does lose its shock factor because of how much it throws at us, while still claiming to be realistic. The glimmer of hope within this bloodbath is a reveal that Big Daddy's origin story was a lie. He was yet another average Joe comic fan who could act as a cautionary tale to Dave, but too concerned with a hyper-violent death to delve delve into that. It is ironic though how Kick-Ass, Red Mist, and now Big Daddy all pretty much have the same origin story, and reinforces that maybe our world just isn't that complex. Case in point, Millar got a big laugh out of me when Hit Girl comes back to save Dave, and they prepare for a final stand against the Genovese crime family. She pulls something out of a utility belt called Condition Red, but it's just coke. No super soldier serum or mutant growth hormone, it's just coke. And this may be hypocritical after saying it was trying too hard to be edgy, but I still laughed. Despite how determined Millar's been to subvert tropes, the climax feels pretty cut and dry. The only subversion being that Hit Girl kicks ass whilst Kick-Ass has a very ugly fight against Red Mist. As much as I think Hit Girl is given plot armor, especially now that we know that her dad didn't have any kind of special training that he could pass on to her, I like that Dave's final fight is as unskilled as it should be, but he still has that determination and would rather die than give up. But perhaps that's me deeping it too much, because in the moment, the final issue is fun and goes out with a bang, whilst also not forgetting to humanize Mindy after the battle is over. If anything, it feels like the epilogue is trying harder to surprise us than the final confrontation, because once Dave is back in school, he finally tells Katie the truth, and the Hollywoodification of stories leads you to believe that she'll confess her feelings too, but instead he's rejected and gets beaten up. One final mean-spirited reminder that this isn't a fantasy world, but the oddest thing about the ending to Kick-Ass is that besides the couple pages teasing that the Red Mist isn't done with Dave, this feels like a sequel wasn't always the plan. Maybe when writing it, Millar wasn't sure if there would be a follow-up, but there's no hint that Dave wants to continue as Kick-Ass. Mindy finally gets a chance to be a child, and we even tie back in with the guy who jumped off the building to open the book. So part of me wonders if this was intended to be a one and done like a lot of Millar's other projects. But the success it saw right out of the gate was greater than he ever anticipated, and he had to capitalize on it. For Dave's story, it's not a happy ending, but it does feel complete. If we never saw him again, we could tell ourselves that his time as Kick-Ass is done with. So if we're wondering what the hell happened to Kick-Ass, maybe we wouldn't need to if it stopped here. People remember Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, and Sandman because of how impactful the story was, and they didn't need sequels to cement the legacy. So perhaps the worst thing that can happen for the long-term success of a series is having such an initial impact right out of the gate. And when it comes to Kick-Ass, it hadn't even reached its peak yet, but it was about to. So the movie rights to a property being sold before the original work has even been published isn't exclusively a Kick-Ass thing, but it's still abnormal. Hollywood doesn't like to take risks, and wants a surefire way of making money. So for Kick-Ass to be in production before it had even proven itself as a comic says a lot about the potential in this property. Millar had wanted to get in touch with Matthew Vaughn following his directing work on Layer Cake, Snatch, and Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. The two immediately became friends, and spoke for hours during the first call, with the two finally meeting in person at the premiere of Stardust in 2007. Millar was eager to collab with Vaughn on an adaptation of American Jesus, a short-lived series that was published by Dark Horse Comics back in 2004. But on hearing the idea for the upcoming Kick-Ass, Matt immediately switched focus and agreed to develop a script alongside the yet-to-be-released comic. That's why when comparing the movie to the comic, it's hard to know what was changed as a conscious choice to differentiate, or simply because Millar hadn't finished his original story yet for the movie to adapt. On top of that, plotting the movie without the completed comic was actually one of the easier parts of production, as not a single studio wanted to develop the script. There were concerns it was too violent, all of them had issues with Hit Girl's age, and they just didn't feel it had a place within the current superhero movie landscape. Vaughn then had to remortgage his house to finance the project so it could be made without the studio interference, and had to bribe his good friend Brad Pitt to sign on as a producer. Originally, Vaughn had intended for Pitt to play Big Daddy, but when this conflicted with the filming of Inglourious Bastards, the role instead went to Nicolas Cage. Over 100 guys auditioned for the lead role, and the inability to find the right actor almost halted production before Aaron Taylor Johnson responded to a casting call. Christopher Mintz-Plasse was one of the many who auditioned for the role of Dave, but Vaughn's screenwriter Jane Goldman had envisioned him as Red Mist, as she was a huge fan of his performance in Superbad.
I am McLovin.
Chloe Grace Moretz rounded out the main cast as Hit Girl, as she was a big fan of the movie Wanted, and liked the idea of doing her own stunts. And if she weren't such a good actress for her age, I'd assume she only got the part because she's another person with a long-ass name. Like seriously, I think that's the real reason Brad Pitt wasn't in this. Filming started in 2008, with the majority of location work taking place in London, Ontario, and Toronto, with the Atomic Comic Shop being based in Arizona, all of which is especially impressive considering the movie is entirely set in New York. Early preview footage released in January January 2010 sparked backlash, mainly around hit girls saying the C word, due to Grace Moritz being 12 at the time of filming. The Australian Family Association was one particular detractor in regards to the language, which is the most ironic complaint that Australia could have made, since the C word is basically their version of mate. But Mintz-Plasse summed it up best when he called out the hypocrisy of the language used by Hit Girl being scrutinised, but not the violence. However, due to elements like this and Vaughn's unwavering commitment to his vision of Kick-Ass, the movie received an R rating in America and a 15 in the UK, debuting at the South by Southwest Film Festival on March 12, 2010, and releasing worldwide shortly after. And this is one of those movies that builds on the source material, and a rare example of where I actually think it's better. For the most part, the plot is beat for beat the same, so I won't reiterate what I already said in part 1, although it does make a few deviations that are interesting, if not always an improvement. Let's just get one thing out of the way. The theme song here is probably more memorable than 90% of MCU movies. I love it, and it just really captures the vibe. In fact, the music's great across the board, whether it be the score or the soundtrack. It's fortunate this came out before most movies just started shoving recognizable songs in everywhere to fool you into liking it, or else Kick-Ass probably would get lumped in with that category. But it's selective and relevant to the tone that each scene is going for. With the plot, the biggest change is the focus on the villains. They're introduced so early on that their presence is felt before Dave ever puts on the suit, rather than being a last-minute inclusion like the Genoveses. This is a risky move too, because it could have added to that sense that Dave wasn't the main character early on, but in actuality it made Red Mist a far more compelling one. On paper, removing the twist that he's part of the crime family doesn't sound like a good idea, but the way he's written and the performance from Mintz-Plasse gives us a better villain. He isn't just a sadistic daddy's boy with unlimited money, but we get to see how desperate he is for his father's validation, and part of him genuinely does care about Dave. We're given that sense that he doesn't fully know about the crime world that he's desperate to get involved in, and I far prefer him here, but because of the changes to Red Mist, it takes away from the central character. Straight off the bat, Aaron Taylor-Johnson does a great job, but he is far too in shape to be Dave. Are you telling me this guy is supposed to be a loser solely because he's got glasses? Dave from the comics looks like he should have his hard drive checked, but Taylor-Johnson is clearly a good-looking dude. All of his friends fit the bill, and aesthetically Mintz-Plasse would have been a more suitable Dave. As well, when he and Mist get to the warehouse, Dave is the one reluctant to run in and help. Sure, Chris knows that people he cares about are in there, but where Dave shined in the book is that he would always throw caution to the wind in these situations. However, another huge win for the movie is with Big Daddy and Hit Girl. I honestly think they're improved on in almost every way. The only exception to that is how we weren't first introduced to them at Eddie Lomas's apartment. It just took away from that sense that Dave is the only one doing this. I love the scenes with Mindy and Damon that weren't in the comic, and I never realised how poorly the original book had developed their relationship until I watched the movie. You can tell he loves his daughter, rather than her just being his sidekick for his vendetta, but because of the goofiness that Cage portrays the character with, I'm stumped why they didn't include the twist about his origin being a lie. Both Millar and Romita Jr have stated it wouldn't have worked in the film, and it helps us to love the character more, but I felt the added scenes with him and Mindy had already accomplished that, and I could 100% see this version of Big Daddy just being an average Joe with a comic obsession. The twist in the comic helped Big Daddy feel more like Dave, that maybe he wasn't so alone in his ambition, but that's not the case in the movie. It also would have worked amazingly because we're given Big Daddy's origin entirely through a comic, almost as if he'd fabricated it. That entire sequence was phenomenal. I heard it took nearly 2 years to make, and it shows. But I am gonna assume this is why Romita Jr wasn't on like 50 titles a month around this time, which is just great that this is a comic book movie that's not afraid of incorporating comic elements. That wasn't a common thing during this time, and when it was, it would get slammed like the Angry Hulk. Another thing I really enjoyed is the action. Of course, that will always be an advantage in a movie over a comic, but the direction still felt like it was trying to push the boat out as far as it could with its smaller budget. The warehouse assault with Big Daddy is probably my favourite of the movie, especially because of how realistic it feels. But all in all, there isn't a bad action set piece in here. Yet for as much as I enjoy this movie, I can't help but feel like it has this weird push-pull thing going on.
We can all pull about a little bit. Try and pull about. Have a little pull and a push.
The violence isn't as grotesque, but packs just as much of a punch, so it feels even more grounded. This means it doesn't come across as desperate to be edgy, and we get small but key moments like Hit Girl catching a breath before charging in, running out of ammo, and kind of being John Wick before John Wick was ever John Wick. All of which does a great job of helping her character not feel as ridiculously overpowered. But then you've got the jetpack. Ask 15-year-old me, and this is insanely cool. But in a movie that started with a guy so incompetent that he couldn't jump across a roof and was stabbed on his first night, It doesn't add up, and I'd lump a few of my criticisms under the umbrella of the story being Hollywoodified. The jetpack being the prime example, because the movie needed a big grand climax, even if it feels disconnected from the rest of Dave's journey. And maybe this one's just me, but for a movie under 2 hours, there are far too many "I'm a second away from near certain death, only to be saved at the last possible moment" scenarios. When it happened the first time, it was fun, but the rhythm of these is near identical every single time. To the point that when the guard is bracing to shoot Hit Girl with the bazooka, I was just waiting for Dave to come and save her. Perhaps this makes me a hypocrite though, but I like Dave getting a Hollywood happy ending with Katie. Sure, the way it unfolds in the comic felt more true to life, like the dude lied for months just to be close to her. But this world doesn't always need to be super bleak or determined to kick Dave whilst he's down. But one thing that hasn't changed from the comic, the references are still dated.
And all the things I'd never do, or see what me and Katie's kids would look like, or find out what happened on Lost.
Spoiler alert, you'll be disappointed. And that answers both of those questions. So if I had to summarize the key differences between the comic and the movie, I'd say the comic is more committed to the concept, whereas the film is more committed to the story. And in a weird way, they both work because of that different focus. If comic Dave killed as much as his movie counterpart did at the end, that wouldn't feel right for a story trying to be a grounded take on the superhero origin. Whereas if Katie did reject Dave in the movie, it wouldn't feel like a satisfying end. So for me to say I prefer one over the other is purely a personal choice rather than any kind of objective truth. Although, despite my inherent narcissism, my opinion isn't the sole deciding factor on a movie's success, but in terms of financials and reception, it did well also. Against an estimated budget of $30 million, the movie grossed $96.2 million worldwide, which meant it ranked 69th at the box office for the year, and was the same budget to profit ratio as similar indie comic adaptations like Red. But there was one chart where Kick-Ass ranked second only to James Cameron's Avatar, and that's on the list of the most pirated movies of the year, according to Torrent Freak, showing that there was a huge fan base for Kick-Ass that didn't want to pay to see the movie. Which is definitely some kind of achievement, I guess. When it came to the critical response, the movie generally received praise, with a 78% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a 7.6 on IMDb, and a 1-star review from Roger Reboot, which, another unpopular opinion, I know the guy's a legend and has passed, so I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but I don't think I've ever seen him give a positive review unless it was for Citizen Kane. Kick-Ass did continue to gain in popularity when it was released on DVD and Blu-ray, with it being something of a cult classic in the years following, and even had a beat-up game released alongside it, but no one seems to remember this. So all in all, for a movie that no studio believed in, about a comic that had barely released or found a dedicated fanbase, launching just as the comic book movie frenzy was taking off, Kick-Ass exceeded expectations. Coupled with the fact that the collected edition of the first 8 issues released just before the movie, this was Kick-Ass's time to ascend. However, an odd phenomenon can occur after an adaptation gains a level of success that the original never had access to. The comic becomes influenced by the thing it spawned. Look at how quickly Tony Stark in the comics became like Robert Downey Jr., the origin of Mr. Freeze being retconned from what we got from the animated series, or the entire personality of the Ninja Turtles resembling their cartoon counterparts more so than the Eastman and Laird originals. With all this in mind, it's not outlandish to think that Millar could be influenced by the Kick-Ass movie whilst continuing the story he started. We've already seen that abandoning the entire concept of Wanted gained him more than the comic ever could. So him being okay with the rocket launcher, the jetpack, the change in Big Daddy's origin, all of these could be early signs that he was fine with his magnum opus moving away from the idea of following a real-life vigilante. And with a movie sequel being rumoured before Kick-Ass 2 even hit the shelves, is it possible that Millar was no longer writing a comic to be a comic, but one that would be adapted into a movie, and the comic was now an afterthought? Okay, now before that one guy that seems to be in the comments of every video jumps down my throat, I know that the Hit Girl miniseries was released after Kick-Ass 2, but chronologically it takes place before the sequel, and if you don't read it in that order, this whole mini spin-off is pointless. Much like with Kick-Ass, we open with a costume vigilante being violently beaten by the mob. Thereafter Kick-Ass and Hit Girl, and are determined to get information out of one of the many heroes that have popped up over New York. Bizarrely though, despite the similarities, the tone here doesn't feel as juvenile from the offset. Maybe it's a lack of narration in this opening, but for some reason it had me hopeful that Millar was switching in the right gear. When we pick back up with Mindy, she's right where we left her at the end of book 1, trying to integrate into a normal kid's life with a mom and a stepdad Marcus. However, High school proves to be more difficult to navigate than the crime-ridden streets of New York. She's the target of bullies, but can't use her hit girl methods to resolve it, and she's haunted by memories of a time with her father. What this spin-off does right is set the emotional stake right out of the gate. It's easy to feel sorry for Mindy because she became so accustomed to being hit girl that Mindy is the trickier disguise to maintain, and the flashbacks to her father remind us that she is still a child that's grieving the loss of her parents. This all comes together to make Mindy a far more layered character than the one that we got in Kick-Ass. Yet this is like Schrodinger's hit girl, because for her to have any kind of staying power she needed to become three-dimensional. But if we get that insight, the novelty of her character is gone. I can't class her as grounded or complex when she's supposed to be a 12-year-old who takes down the mafia with little to no struggle. She's also basically the Terminator, because no grown adult, gang, or entire crime family can even go toe-to-toe with her. And I'm just not buying that. She's so overpowered that she makes Big Daddy look like the sidekick in hindsight. The worst part is that she's clearly a 12-year-old that's written like a middle-aged man. Prime example, there's one scene where she's killing people on death row and says it's to save on taxpayers' money. But I thought you were supposed to be 12. I can barely buy into all the killing she does, but why would a kid who has never had a job, all paid taxes, and lives off the money left by her father know or care about what taxpayers think? Do we just brush this off as she's echoing something she must have heard her dad say? Dave even calls her out when she mentions the deficit caused by Obama, but it doesn't change Mindy, so it's just kinda there. I don't even know what age she's supposed to be here because it takes place straight after the first book, yet feels like she's 5 years older than she was there. Dave is the same age, so what gives? Speaking of Dave, he's Mindy's only friend at school, and they spend their breaks plotting the next move now that Ralph Genovesi's taken over the crime syndicate after Hit Girl and Kick-Ass took out his brother, leading to the most unrealistic thing in this entire series. No one in this entire school calls him a nonce. The 16-year-old who looked like he should have already been on the register, got bullied anyway, and quietly hangs out with the 12-year-old girl who has no friends. That's a prime scenario for some trolling, especially in the Facebook era. In my high school, you'd get called a nonce if your friend was a year younger, even if you were in the same school year. But what I like from Millar here is a better setup of the villains. Not only is there a stronger focus from the get-go, but he also expands on the hierarchy from the first book. Now, the villain exists as a direct result of Dave and Mindy's actions, so they're not just spectators, but partly the cause. And perhaps it was changing the perspective from Dave's to Mindy's, but Ralphie was a far more threatening presence from the second he entered. This is why Mindy recruited herself to be Dave's trainer, so that they can face any crime bosses that come after them. And considering that this was the bulk of the plot, she is not a good teacher. But Millar's banking hard on you thinking she is. I don't get why Dave would follow a lead, when her methodology is the same as when Dave wanted to learn a rooftop jump in book 1 by just doing it. She has no actual training, and we now know all she'd learned was from a guy who was faking everything anyway. If Dave was being a student to help her overcome her father's death, that would make sense. But her lessons consist of rushing in headfirst into gang territories, except now there's no one watching Hit Girl's back like she needed when taking on Eddie Lomas. So I'm not buying into this concept. The trade-off that makes this bearable is that Dave only agrees to help if she'll take lessons from him in fitting in as a regular teenager. You know, cause he's such a good example. But I don't know why he bothered when he could have just made a one-sentence instruction. You know, make non-stop pop culture references. It was irritating in book 1, but now it's exhausting. Everyone does it now, even me in this next sentence, because it's like an episode of The Big Bang Theory because rarely is it done well, but just a signpost that characters know that real things exist. Prime example, the 12-year-old bully Debbie threatens to shatter Mindy's brain like she's Charlie Sheen, and she thinks that's a remotely good diss. Was there some kind of quota that Millar needed to hit per issue for these? Because that's the only explanation why some of them are so ham-fisted. Originally it was part of Dave's character, but now it just seems to be a disease throughout the whole universe. It was so bad, they made me second guess what could just be a regular sentence. Hit Girl says she'll keep someone in one piece, and it had me like, oh, I ain't a manga guy, so I don't know what she means. Side note, why does Debbie look exactly like MJ? Was this not jarring for anyone else? Romita Jr, I complimented you in the earlier part. You know how difficult that was for me? Don't make me regret that. Another trope I'm already burnt out on is the, oh, you thought this would happen? Well, it's actually the opposite, to the point where it gets predictable in how it's trying to be unpredictable. So Mindy views a social situation like an undercover surveillance mission and wants to befriend the bullies, so she gets a makeover, new clothes, a happy montage to lull you into thinking that things will go away. But then Debbie calls out how this won't do a 180 for her social status like she believes. How many more times will the series do this? It was quirky in the beginning, but now works against what they were doing for Mindy's character, as this makes her revert to type, call Debbie a bitch, and threaten her by dangling her from a rooftop. So why not just do that from day one? It's oddly like Debbie deserved a fair chance. She bragged about making other students depressed, so throw off more buildings if anything. It would have been less predictable if they just didn't lean into a cliche at all. The subverting a trope is becoming more of a cliche than the trope it's trying to subvert, and sometimes it's okay to lean into an expectation. Like if I mentioned how Miller's titles are being collected in these beautiful library editions, the trope would suggest that I'm going to talk about the channel's sponsors, which is exactly what I'm going to do. I don't know if that's synced up at all. But yes, if you're in the EU and you want to pick up any books, I definitely recommend going to Comics Bugle. They've got a great pre-order system, fast reliable shipping, and you can get points on every purchase that you make that you can then later use to get discounts. And if you use code WOOFWOOF at the checkout of your first order, you will get €5 off. They've also recently launched merch, and I'm someone who wears clothes weekly, so I definitely recommend having a look at that as well, as these are really comfy. But if you're not in the EU and you want that same level of service, then the only place that you need to go is Panelbound Comics. They've supported me since year one of this channel, and they've got great prices and some of the best customer service around. So if you're making an order, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, but if you're ordering 4 or more items, then make sure you use code WOOFWOOF ship it together so that you can get a discount on everything that you buy. Here's just a sample of some of the Miller World books that you can pick up, and I also think that Image is releasing a compendium for Kick-Ass, so that might be worth checking out as well. I didn't dislike this Hit Girl spin-off though, and I get that that's probably how it's coming across, but one story I was quite invested in was Marcus's. And no, not just because of his name, although it didn't hurt. He's an honest officer within the corrupt police force that is being paid off by the mob that Mindy's trying to take down. He knows she's Hit Girl, but wants to do everything he can to protect Mindy's mother from finding out. At the same time, his boss is putting on pressure to bring Hit Girl in because they're paid by the mob, and it just makes him one of the most complex characters in the series. For once, we're really seeing how this whole scenario affects someone other than the main character, and I think this is what Dave's story was missing. Sure, he was there, but Marcus trying to curb vigilantism whilst not getting lost in the corruption is far more interesting than Dave's dad navigating online dating, especially since Marcus and Mindy could benefit massively from one another. They both want the same thing, and it's around this time that Dave injured his hand, leaving Hit Girl alone in a battle. But this forced me to ask one huge question. Who is paying for Dave's medical bills? I'm not clued up on how insurance works in America, you know. Call me crazy, but I like not going bankrupt when I get a migraine. But Dave comes from a one-parent income, and it's not established if Mindy's giving him money. All I'm saying is, if it wants to go down this, here's what it would be like if someone really tried to be a hero route, then it should really answer this. Although, there is one huge benefit to Dave being out of action, and that's Hit Girl finally having a struggle beyond Marcus keeping an eye on her. When going solo to take down a Colombian operation, she misjudges the chimney used to enter, and gets caught. Great cliffhanger. Except that she already had C4 set to explode, which makes her whole plan of needing to infiltrate seem kinda pointless. It's a shame too, because the brief glimpse we had there could have made this whole spin-off special if it had capitalized on it. Why not have this whole story be her figuring out how to be a solo hero now that Big Daddy's gone? Have her be out of her depth. Maybe make Dave's injury entirely her fault because of how unqualified she is. And by the end of the book, have her realise that she was just a sidekick and now needs to stand on her own 2 feet. Hell, they could have even had her accept that maybe she was better at the tactical side and become something of an oracle figure so that Marcus no longer needs to worry and connect all of the plots together. But it hasn't been that, and it's just more of the same. It was so close to realising that potential as well, as one of the best scenes comes in the final issue. After the mob goes to Marcus's house to kill him, Mindy takes everyone out, and we get a brief yet touching moment where she talks with the memory of her father who gives her guidance, and this should have been a constant. Besides maybe one flashback, there's been no hint that this is how she's getting through situations, but had the story been about her relying too heavily on the ghost of her father, but not being there physically to bail her out like he did in the first Kick-Ass, this scene in the final issue could have been an emotional goodbye, of her accepting that she can't rely on a voice that's no longer there, and has to stop trusting that she'll always breeze through any fight. And I started this part by saying that if you don't read Hit Girl before Kick-Ass 2, then the whole thing is kinda pointless. But that wouldn't have been the case if Mindy had gone on a journey where she developed as a character, but instead she's Dr. Manhattan. She can't be killed, she She can take life at the click of a finger, and nowhere is off limits. The ending to this is her appearing in Ralphie's cell and gunning down everyone on death row, because she can gas every member of staff without getting a single prisoner, hack the cameras, and go back home without a single repercussion. Marcus, the only point of conflict in her life, has a convenient all's well that ends well attitude so that Mindy doesn't have to have a problem. Kick-Ass was fun because it had that grip on some form of reality. The most memorable moments came from when Dave was confronted by the harsh truth of trying to be a superhero within the modern world. Hit Girl and Big Daddy were fine back then because they weren't the central characters, so we could assume that there was some nuance to them. But this was our chance to get a peek behind the curtains, and all we learned is that Hit Girl really is... There's no sense that this could actually happen, and there's zero development or lesson that she learned over this entire spin-off. Even the aspect of her being a teacher isn't developed. Nothing about this tussle with Ralphie has made her reevaluate that maybe she doesn't know everything, nor that she can impart anything different now on Dave. She was a poor teacher at the start, and this doesn't leave me at a point where I'm excited to see where their dynamic could go. But speaking about a journey that's taught us absolutely nothing, I've deliberately avoided talking about the Red Mist storyline. This picks up with Chris as he sets up his operation to become a supervillain, and we see his first couple of attempts at committing super crimes. However, what should have happened to Mindy happens to him, as he's thwarted during his first robbery and bailed out by the police captain, who was also Marcus's boss. He's shipped off to some ancient mountains where this universe's version of the League of Shadows live, where he's scammed for his money and still can't win a fight. So he runs off to do drugs in Eastern Europe. Probably should have mentioned this before, but after Kick-Ass 1, he just forgot Dave's identity. They chalk it up as he didn't write it down and he didn't trust it was real because it was under torture, but really, it's for plot convenience. Because in the closing pages of this already pointless spin-off, Red Mist just remembers Dave's identity because of the right combination of drugs. I wish I was making that up, but you know what, there's far more contrived setups that I could keep picking faults with instead. But that highlights my overall opinion on the Hit Girl series. Pointless. I doubt anyone who read Kick-Ass 2 on release was left wondering if Chris did any training just to end up at the same level of fighter that he was at the beginning, or how Dave and Mindy got the training off the ground. Which leads me to ask, why did Millar think this was a necessary chapter? The gaps it bridges were easy enough to walk across already, but what he could have done right with this prime opportunity to develop Mindy into something beyond a gimmick character is squandered. It doesn't scratch any kind of itch beyond just giving us more Hit Girl, and I think that was the only objective. By the time the movie came out and the first series was completed, Millar was deep into Kick-Ass 2. Hit Girl had only just become the breakout star of the universe, and Millar didn't have as much time to focus on her instead. Everything about this book, even to the way it's retroactively being made into the second chapter, has me wondering if maybe what the hell happened to Kick-Ass is that it was neglected by its creator. I can't imagine how Millar must have felt going into Kick-Ass 2. The first issue released at the end of 2010. Peak Kick-Ass hype. People who had been there from day one or were joining as a result of the movie were finally given more, and what this immediately paid off on was a sense of progression. The opening isn't as balls-to-the-wall paced as the original, but characters have moved forward and the world has adapted. More heroes have popped up across New York, and everyone is networking, doing team-ups, forming groups, and surprisingly, Dave isn't a pushover anymore. He can fight now. He doesn't immediately get stabbed or beaten, unless of course he's up against Hit Girl. This sequel opens on Dave getting his ass handed to him by Mindy as part of his training. She can manhandle him and throw him about like she isn't half his size, because she's so overpowered that she has to tap in 3 brutes because Dave has more of a chance against them somehow. This just confirms my suspicion that this will no longer be Dave's story. Millar will do everything to protect Mindy, and that's why Dave has to be embarrassed by her at every opportunity. Dave was coming along great in other aspects, but when Mindy's there, he's a jobber in his own book. Damn, I never thought I'd want to see a 12-year-old beaten up this badly. Well, except for that time my neighbours at my old place put a trampoline next to my living room window. But having Dave's perspective again is a welcome return after the spin-off. One advantage of Mindy shoulder barging away into the main character role is that Dave doesn't feel like as much of a walking reference machine this time, and the ones he does use are so on point that I had to Google Adam Hughes' Scarlet Witch to remember how damn fine she is. And Dave makes a good point there, because she... Ah, damn it, I'll be back in a minute. As well, for as harsh on the spin-off as it was, it does give deeper context into why Mindy can't go back to being a vigilante despite Dave begging. Also, it helps Marcus come across as something other than a stick in the mud because we know how Gigante almost had him killed. So although they weren't dots that needed connecting, there is some benefit to Hit Girl's story. She is still committed to honouring a promise to Marcus and not crime fighting, but still helping Dave during school hours. The lack of on-the-ground support leads to Dave meeting up with Justice Forever, a group led by Colonel Stars. Yep, Hit Girl needs an entire team to fill a shadow, but this is a fun team, and by far the most exciting inclusion in this sequel. The fun Millar's having with these Avenger-like heroes just oozes off the page, and even little touches like certain members not being at a particular meeting because they're working a late shift is one of the better subtle humour moments. At the first meeting, they all introduce themselves and give an exposition dump. One especially harrowing story comes from Battle Guy, who saw his parents murdered, cooked, and eaten in front of him whilst he was still a child. Except this is bullshit because Dave immediately recognises that it's his friend Marty. Yeah, once again, it's like the Big Daddy twist that the origin story is a complete lie, but since it's revealed immediately, it doesn't feel derivative of what we've already had. And I don't know if it's a result of seeing a Hollywoodified version of Dave's life, but it's nice having these moments where Dave can be happy. Justice Forever is the moral support he needed as Kick-Ass, and Marty is finally the confidant his personal life was lacking. But this is the perfect time to admit that I think I really hate all of Dave's friends. And you know what, if he wasn't narrating the book, I'd probably hate Dave as well. I get that's probably the point Millar was going for, but he's almost making too good of a point. However, all of this stuff I was loving is so short-lived that it almost feels like it wasn't worth introducing. After just a few scenes with Justice Forever, and only one bust where we can see how they operate and the dynamics of a big team in this world, they are brutally targeted by Red Mist's new gang. Yep, I know he renamed himself to be the motherfucker, and that is way easier to say with my lisp, but he's still the Red Mist to me. But the killing of Colonel Stripes was too excessive. It's that edginess to the point where it's cringy. Killing the dog was bad enough, but mangling his head onto the Colonel? I don't even care if it makes me seem soft. But that's Millar thinking to himself, what's the most sadistic, vile death that I can put on the page to shock people? And because of that, it's not shocking, it's just overkill. And honestly, that seems to be the mantra of this whole sequel. Red Mist doesn't stop with the Colonel, and takes his newly assembled villain group to the estate Katie DeMo lives at, so that they can gun down a bunch of kids that just happen to be in the street. He then beats and violently sexually assaults Katie. Yeah, this video's not getting monetized. You see what I'm saying about being sadistic for the sake of it? There's no scenario where this would feel suitable, but Katie has nothing to do with Dave in the comic anymore. The Colonel's death was more than enough to prove how evil Red Mist is, but this whole scene in Katie's neighborhood could be removed and absolutely nothing about the plot would change. That's how needless and over the top it is. I only remember it because of how hard it was trying to be shocking, rather than because it was a turning point for Dave. And also, why would Dave be allowed to see her in hospital? She clearly does not want to be friends with him. And as if the attack on Justice Forever and Katie wasn't enough, Red Mist's actions caused the NYPD to bring in everyone in a costume, leading the police to Dave's door, only for his dad to take the fall instead. One thing I was really pleased about in Kick-Ass 2 was how Dave's dad became more of a character. Not enough for me to remember his name, but still. After seeing how Millar had used Marcus to improve Hit Girl's story, I was excited when we got the moment earlier when Mr. Lizewski confronted Dave about his late night escapades and later found his Kick-Ass costume. In just a few issues, he'd already had more of a presence than he had in the entirety of Kick-Ass 1, so having him arrested was more than enough to prove how committed Red Mist was to ruining Dave's life without the needless assault of Katie. Except that Millar has Mr. Lizewski killed off fairly quickly. Don't get me wrong, as soon as he went to jail I knew it was curtains, but this one move cheapened all of the good work that Millar had done with him, because it felt like the sole reason for those earlier scenes was so that his death had more oomph. To channel my inner Dave, it's like how Mufasa in The Lion King says he'll always be there for Simba 2 minutes before he dies. It's just tempting fate. So everything I'd enjoyed about this sequel had been ruined before we'd barely reached the halfway point. And the worst part about it is how the potential had been squandered solely for shock value. Take Justice Forever for example. We get a montage where we see the positive impact that they're having on society, and not just with the crime fighting, but how they also help out homeless shelters and have structured patrols on the subway, all to reinforce that they want to have a positive change on the world. Then once Colonel Stars is killed, they disappear. It would have been nice to have that last for more than one issue, and explore the idea of vigilantes becoming a makeshift police force in New York, especially because there is another layer to this that I wanted to see explored, and that's how destructive Kick-Ass and his allies are, but how their cognitive bias has them believe that everything they do is right. With the one bust that we see Justice Forever do, they rescue the people, sure, but in terms of violence, we we don't see what they've done, we're just told it by Colonel Stars, and we know firsthand how dishonest some of these other heroes can be. So, not to rewrite someone else's book, but this could have gone in a direction that perhaps Dave spawned the very problem that he needs to stop when Justice Forever really goes off the deep end. Even Gigante gives a similar speech to Chris, so why not just apply that to the main hero? But of course, we couldn't get an intricate, complex narrative that explores the snowball effect a vigilante in the real world could have, because we need the story to be about Hit Girl. Sure, yeah, it was inevitable. The entire time Red Mist crime spree was going on, we cut away to Mindy watching the news. But despite all of my complaints, her finally snapping at Mr. Lizewski's funeral felt earned. Although it does require far too many plot conveniences, such as Dave, the recently released from prison Justice Forever members, and the entire NYPD believing that Red Mist would be a man of his word. Despite instigating the death of Dave's father, everyone trusts when he says that there'll be a 3-day ceasefire whilst the funeral is going on. So is everyone in this book besides Mindy the dumbest person? This is the same guy that point blank shot a bunch of kids and targeted a girl that Dave hadn't spoken to in over 6 months just to get to him. But everyone just believes that he won't pull something at the funeral for a man that he got killed? That's where they think the line is drawn? Sure enough, and to no one's surprise, it's a trap, with Dave being easily kidnapped because his grief has caused him to be so heavily medicated that he could barely speak. Although he's fully coherent the second that he's in the van. Shots then rain through the roof, with not a single one hitting Dave somehow, and Mindy has finally snapped back into being Hit Girl. And as annoyed as I am that this is basically Hit Girl 2 instead of Kick-Ass 2, Millar did choose the exact right moment to throw her back into the mix. It would have been bigger if we weren't following her mundane life each issue until now, but with the guilt she felt over Mr. Lizewski's death and the fact she's been sidelined all this time, her snapping to save Dave was the best way the book could have gone about this. Considering the bleak and glum path it had been on since the death of Colonel Stars, this was the level of lunacy that the book needed to get back on track. And not only was it back on track, it was going so fast it was running out of it. I don't know if Millar thought he had 8 issues to work with again, and the last one snuck up on him, or maybe he didn't want to repeat the delays of book 1, but from the moment Mindy's back as Hit Girl, it's non-stop, which is great for the adrenaline, but the story also takes massive leaps in logic to get to where it wants to be, and skims over a lot of possibly interesting moments. Hit Girl and Kick-Ass go straight from the kidnapping to the supervillain HQ, and the guy who also assaulted Katie alongside Red Mist is waiting right there. Dave beats him within an inch of his life, and honestly, I thought he killed him. The dude threw him into an aquarium with a shark in it. What else was I supposed to think? And unlike how the movie skimmed over Dave being okay with killing, I thought the book was going to explore that, show how his anger leads to him taking a life, and how that makes him question what his original purpose was. It's clear Dave was getting carried away, but despite hitting the big guy in the back of the head multiple times with a baton that has nails sticking out of it, the guy's fine, and somehow able to blab about Red Mist's plan to take over Times Square. I swear Millar was aware of how badly he was just glossing over any development for Dave, because when he does get a breather and breaks down about how the world is descending into chaos from something that he started, Mindy just calls him a pussy. Mark could have even implied that Dave's crying here is an outlet for his repressed emotions over his father and Katie, rather than it just being a pause for an unfunny punchline before the next action set piece. And you know what? It's because you can feel Millar's excitement to get to the Times Square showdown. It's been building since the beginning, and for as plodding as the pace was earlier on, this moment paid off. It's chaotic, and easily some of the best, most detailed and dynamic art that we've seen from Romita Jr. since his time on JMS's Spider-Man. There's just so much to look at that it carries a sense of frenzy that we needed so that we could be worried about Dave and Mindy again. I don't think Hit Girl assembling a bunch of people we've never met to help out really did much of anything besides make the numbers fair, but I can't lie, this restored that sense that anything could happen. We finally got a bit of development with Dave too, because he has improved on his fighting so that he can take on Chris. Him hoping he could pay his way through life has caught up with him, and it was vindicating to see. Hit Girl finally gets a competitive fight as well, but because she's been such a Mary Sue, there's nothing she can do to gain the upper hand like Dave can, and just has to wait for the plot to save her. In fact, the plot does all the heavy lifting in this final issue, to the point where it's bordering on lazy. After Kick-Ass is just about to defeat Red Mist, the riot police intervene, and form a barricade with Chris on the other side, yet Dave just gets through with no issue and they don't bother showing us how. Are you telling me that the riot police wouldn't be able to stop a 16-year-old boy that they were all just looking at, and the second phase of the fight was filled with moments like this. It was fun seeing how desperate he got, but does everyone in this universe have a bulletproof back of the head? So Chris can't take a punch, but he can take a nail back to the neck. I get Dave has the plates in his skull, but he can take the full impact of a paint can and barely miss a step? Maybe he's got metal eyes too, since Chris throws a handful of nails and not a single one scratches him. These might sound like nitpicks, but when I noticed this laziness in the bigger moments, I realised it was everywhere. The only part that felt like it was given the proper time was after Dave pushes Chris off the roof and leaves him severely injured. Had he not beaten that guy nearly to death just a few hours before, this would have had even more weight, but it still felt like one of those times where everything stopped so that we could feel the magnitude of the moment. This was a great scene that had me asking if Dave had gone too far and forgotten what his original goal was, but at the same time, Mindy doesn't make sense here. So that Dave can escape, Hit Girl steals a car and leads the NYPD across the city. Vic Gigante, the officer who has been working with the Genovese crime family this entire time and was the reason why Marcus and her mom nearly got killed in the spin-off, stands in the road because he knows Hit Girl must have a moral code. Sure enough, his plan works, and Hit Girl crashes the car despite the fact that she's been a flawless driver up until now. The road looked quite clear, and she's been so omnipotent that surely she figured out Gigante was on the take. Why not just have Marcus stand in the road? It would have made more sense, and I wouldn't have had an issue with any of it. Honestly, why is this book so determined to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory? And that's where the book ends. Annoyingly, despite the leaps in logic it took to get there, I was intrigued to see what was next. Hit Girl and Marcus were arrested, Dave was on the run, and Chris left in critical condition. I wanted to know where Millar would take that, but at the same time, I couldn't forget those problems I had with the beginning of Kick-Ass 2. Often, a sequel can be a true representation of the creator's vision than the original, as they've laid the groundwork and proven themselves enough to have a fan base so that they can take more risks. Yet there's so much in this second chapter that felt influenced by Hollywood that it's hard to know what's true to the original vision and what was a late addition. It feels half comic and half proposal for the second movie, and I can't tell if Millar was trying to push his luck with the assault on Katie and the battle in Times Square to see what he could create and get on the big screen, or if that was the plan from the beginning. So, for as much intrigue as I had towards the future, I couldn't tell if this was a sign that the series was turning things back around, or a case of it being too little too late. I'll be honest, I didn't realise until scripting this that I'd never watched Kick-Ass 2. By the time it released in theatres in August of 2013, the comic had been out for 3 years and the zest that made the original film so great had permeated into pop culture. Also, the path to Kick-Ass 2 making it on screen made the production of the first movie seem like a walk in the park. Instead of striking while the iron was hot in 2010, Kick-Ass 2 stalled out of the gate, with there being uncertainty as to if a sequel would even get off the ground. Matthew Vaughn, who owned the movie rights to the franchise, had impressed 20th Century Fox with Kick-Ass to the point where he was offered to direct X-Men First Class. With the visionary behind the original busy elsewhere, he could only return as producer, and it wasn't until May of 2012 when Universal announced that they picked up the sequel that there was a real confirmation it would even happen. All of the main cast who hadn't died in the first one were set to return, but time can't pause for a movie, and Chloe Grace Moretz was now 3 years older than the character she was supposed to be playing. So although it was combining the story of both Kick-Ass 2 and the Hit Girl spin-off, revisions were made to reflect the actress's current age. The only two notable absences were Amari Hardwick as Marcus, who's replaced by Maurice Chestnut, and Augustus Prue replaced Evan Peters as Todd, because the prospect of playing Quicksilver is probably more enticing in every conceivable way than being ass-kicker. Oddly though, it means that 2 out of the 3 members of the core friend group have played Quicksilver at some point in their career, which would make me feel some kind of way if I was Clark Duke. By far, the biggest addition to the sequel was Jim Carrey, who would play a combined version of Colonel Stars and Lieutenant Stripes, but bizarrely, his casting would become the biggest controversy of the whole movie. Despite having completed filming for Kick-Ass 2, Carrey denounced the level of violence in the movie following the Sandy Hook school shooting. Millar, Moritz, and others from the production responded, calling out the hypocrisy considering that far more violent movies exist, and the lack of connection between the tragedy and Kick-Ass 2 considering they hadn't even released yet. Then it's a really good job that they didn't fully adapt Red Mist Attack on Kate's Neighborhood. Despite this, the movie went forward, with filming beginning in September in Ontario, Canada, and London, England until November 2012. Admittedly, there wasn't a lot of buzz in the run-up to the movie, not like there was the first time round, and it quietly released in August of 2013. Even watching it for the first time for this video, I had very low expectations, and I have to admit, I enjoyed it. It does fall short of the original, but this is nowhere near as bad as the general consensus would have you believe. And much like Kick-Ass 1, it makes changes from the source material, some for the better, and a few for the worse. First up, maintaining Dave narrating for the whole movie, including over the Mindy parts from its spin-off, helped her to not feel as insufferable as she does in the comics. In fact, I overall preferred the changes made to Mindy here, and Moretz has really come on as an actress between the two movies. Aging her up was the exact right choice, rather than try to pretend that she's still 12. And because of that, some of the parts taken from a spin-off were better here than they were in the comic. Maybe that's what Millar should have done, because the subplot with her being bullied felt far more authentic, even if there were entire scenes stolen from Mean Girls. She makes an effort off her own back to try and fit in. She's given agency and a desire to belong, and even finds ways to make her life as hit girl work in the real world. It borrowed heavily from coming-of-age stories, but on reflection, that's what the comics lacked for her development. Honestly, her getting stood up on a date was heartbreaking, and true to how horrible teenagers can be. But if there's one aspect of this I wish had been taken from the comic, it's the revenge. The sick stick just didn't work for me. I would have far preferred to see Mindy dangle that girl off a roof, and I think it would have worked better. So considering the shorter runtime, my concern about blending the two series wasn't an issue at all, but I have to address the time skip. Why do I feel like only Mindy was aged up? It's the exact opposite problem I had with the spin-off, because if she was 12 in movie 1 and 15 now, that's a 3-year jump, meaning 16-year-old Dave should now be 19 and not in school, but that's never addressed. Are you telling me that Dave, Todd, Marty, and Katie all got held back a year? The guy apparently still can't do one pull-up at the start, and you're expecting me to believe this absolutely jacked to the gills, possibly roided up dude, after 3 years as Kick-Ass can't do a pull-up? If that is the case, Dave, retire. And put a t-shirt on already, because I'm trying to watch the movie and you're just there, oiled up and not doing a pull-up.
I am gay.
I'm gonna need another minute. In fact, most of the things I don't like about this movie are because of Dave. Again, not a knock at Aaron Taylor-Johnson, he does a good job, but more with the writing of his character. It starts with the dialogue. Early on, Dave brings up to Mindy about how Big Daddy died in the pursuit of their goal, but completely neglects that he'd probably still be alive if they'd never met. And the references, Jesus Christ, there's not even a punchline to him now. It's just name dropping with no substance. In one scene, Dave says, "What if Spider-Man or Batman died one day?" And I was just like, they have. Both of them. And quite recently to when this movie is set. The mantle just got passed on to someone else, so what point are you trying to make? I thought Dave was supposed to be a comics guy. In fact, they stripped Dave of all of his personality. Besides these random pop culture references, he doesn't have anything interesting about him now. You could say it's because he's consumed by being Kick-Ass, but when this movie starts, he's convincing Mindy to train him. So what's he been doing between the two movies? Or has he been sat waiting for a sequel for 3 years? My theory is that, like in the book, Dave isn't the main character anymore. It's not as big of a problem because Mindy is better here, but it's still clearly the case. One great moment is that scene where Dave is begging Mindy to train him, and it makes more sense for her character that she'd agree, but it relegates Dave. And that goes for the love subplot as well. I don't know if the timing wasn't great, or Lindsay Fonseca was doing that trailer for the final season of How I Met Your Mother, rather than an alternate ending that wasn't a slap in the face to all the fans. But are you telling me they gave Dave a good ending with Katie in the last movie, subverted everything about the comic, just to have her immediately dump Dave and never show up again? It doesn't even make sense. She knows his secret identity. But let's not beat around the bush. It was done so that we could have that ending forced on us. Yeah, that felt wrong. And just convinced me that we really were supposed to believe that only Mindy's been aged up. Was anyone shipping these two? It's not completely out of left field because we've seen Mindy acknowledge that she's growing up and whatever the fuck that scene with Union J was. Side note, what the hell is a Union J? I'm British, surely I should have an idea, but I genuinely thought this was some kind of in-universe boy band, and I hate that I wasted time checking. Did this band bribe the director or something? Because they got more screen time than Katie. But anyway, there is stuff like that, the date attempt, Mindy looking at Dave's jack to the girl's body, and I still feel like the kiss at the end doesn't work. You can build up to it as much as you want, it doesn't mean I'm gonna like it. It's ironic too, because when Katie suspected they were a thing, he gets called out for being a nonce, but then does nothing to stop the kiss at the end. There's too much of an age gap in the movie, let alone the fact that Johnson was in his 20s in real life. And I don't know about anybody else, but these two always came across like a brother-sister dynamic. There is zero sexual chemistry between them, and we've even seen Dave bone in Night Bitch throughout, so it really puts a dampener on the whole movie. It's one of those decisions so bad they makes you look back on the original in a new and worse light. Like, was Dave flirting with this 12-year-old when they originally revealed their identities? However, I mentioned it there, but Night Bitch and pretty much all of the new heroes are far more memorable here. Jim Carrey gives an understated performance that only adds to the experience. He doesn't fully fill the shadow left by Nick Cage, but he gives it a damn good go. Thinking back on the boot, Colonel Stars is only introduced for his brutal death. I can't tell you anything else memorable about him, but here he had a personality. His final stand felt heroic, and I'm just grateful they didn't do anything to the dog. We get more time with Justice Forever as well, so it doesn't feel like they're solely included just so that they can be torn apart. In fact, a lot of the characters were improved on. It genuinely felt sad when Dave's dad was killed because with just the odd moment here and there, they made him likable and gave us the sense he was Dave's biggest champion. Even that weird apocalypse-looking goth kid that bumped into Dave at school at a point because he was clearly there in the final battle. That might have happened in the comic, but if it did, I can't tell you for sure. But not all of the characters get buffed. Todd was far from my favourite character before, but he is brain dead in the sequel. I wish I could chalk it up to losing Evan Peters, but regardless, he is directly responsible for Dave's father being murdered. But they frame it as if he earned a redemption arc in the end. I am not happy that he's their friend again, not in the slightest. The guy was so dumb he directly walked up to a guy who calls himself a supervillain and doxed his best friend. He's the one who should have been fed to the shark. Chris is probably the biggest victim in this regard, and he's more like his comic counterpart, with all the depth of Vaughn's original being lost somewhere. From the very first scene where he kills his mom, it just feels off and it doesn't improve. I even chalked it up to him losing his mind after his father's death, but that falls short in the scenes where he tries to be intimidating. Take his scene with Ralphie in prison. Is Chris really supposed to be matching his energy here? Should Ralphie leave the room worried about what Chris might do? The one fun angle of this, where the dynamic with Javier parallels an evil Bruce Wayne and Alfred, is ruined because the script doesn't trust that we can spot that. Even the script neglects the fact that he tried to cut corners whilst Dave dedicated to his training, because in what realm would he be able to fight Kick-Ass in the final battle? I guess it must be the same logic that Mindy can easily take out a trained UFC fighter. Like, an eye poke took him out? Seriously? He should be used to that. He rarely gets a point deduction in the octagon. I'm glad Chuck Liddell didn't take any shit though. However, some changes were for the better, and by that I mean everything about the sexual assault. Firstly, changing it from Katie to Night Bitch at least keeps it connected to the story at play, and I liked her and Dave as this Spider-Man Black Cat-like couple. So Red Mist is targeting an active component to the plot. The rampage through the neighborhood is focused on the chaos, rather than just being as grim as it can possibly be. And most importantly, it shows how pathetic Chris is. This should have always been the point of this moment. He shouldn't be able to have his way with anyone, even when he's paid off everyone to ensure it can happen. I'll be honest, I was worried as the scene built up, but fortunately it avoided making such a pivotal mistake. Perhaps the reason why they made that change is because this isn't a comic. You might not pick up on that at first because they only have characters mention it every other scene. It's not a comic? Really? This moving image isn't me reading right now. Other movies that don't mention this, are they actually comics? Are they food instead? Is this why all the comic flair and style from the first movie is absent? Because you don't want to confuse me into thinking this movie's a comic? It's such an odd omission too, because the overall tone is clearly trying to continue what Vaughn started, but it avoids bringing in a lot of the comic elements. The weird title card, sure, but Kick-Ass 2 didn't seem to want to bask in the comic whimsy that the first movie set up so well. The way I'd sum this up is that this is a letdown as a sequel to Kick-Ass, but for the most part is an improvement as an adaptation of Kick-Ass 2. I'm not sure if I'd feel the same way if the franchise had continued, but somehow this feels like both a final chapter and yet an unsatisfying conclusion. Sure, that kiss did not help, but Dave and Mindy feel like they've learned who they want to be in this world. Even Chris is in that same bracket, although I didn't realise there was a post-credit scene until later. But then there's that hanging thread of Ralphie that makes me wonder if this was supposed to pay off into a third movie, or maybe a Hit Girl spin-off. Sure, it might have been there just in case the movie did well, but then it would have had to pull something really contrived out the bag to force Dave and Mindy to team up again. And I don't need to see if they try to make it as a couple. Regardless, the overall response to Kick-Ass 2 paled in comparison to the first, and meant that we'll probably never know if Ralphie's plot was meant to go anywhere. Against a reported budget of $28 million, it only grossed $60.8 million, which was a steep decline from the first movie. Critically, it only garnered a 33% approval score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 41 out of 100 on Metacritic. The general consensus was that it failed to live up to the original, with some theorising that it was due to the shock value not being there anymore. Disappointingly, or maybe not so much, I can't see it on the top 10 list of the most pirated movies for 2013. But Quentin Tarantino said it was one of the 10 best films he watched that year, which has to count for something. Interestingly, fans of the comics picked up on how the climax wasn't as grand scale as the Battle of Times Square. The main reason for the downgrade was because of the significant costs and logistical issues it posed. But regardless, it became something of a symbol that Kick-Ass maybe didn't have the legs it first thought. Other movies and TV shows have been able to film there, but clearly a bigger backing was needed. There was a ceiling now for Kick-Ass, and between this change and the fact that some of the more controversial moments from the comic were avoided entirely, I have to wonder if the reason why Kick-Ass maybe faded away is because Millar's passion waned if it couldn't be a huge success on the screen also. Now, I was a tad disingenuous with that closing chapter there, because Kick-Ass 3's first issue was published just 1 month before the theatrical release of Kick-Ass 2. Yet with how long a movie production takes and the issues that were cropping up throughout, I feel the movie was likely to have an impact on this comic more than this would have had on a movie that was already about to be released. Although, if Millar was determined to lean into the subverting a trope gimmick, he should have opened Kick-Ass 3 by mentioning that the third entry in a trilogy is never the best. Then I think the intention behind this concluding chapter would have been clear, but still the Kick-Ass 2 comic ended with a huge amount of momentum, and I was excited to see where it would go with that last minute shot of adrenaline. But by God was this determined to let the meat spoil. The pace is immediately obliterated before he even had a chance to use it, as we open on a letter from Hit Girl to Dave, with detailed plans of how to break her out of any of the nearby high security prisons, which she must have devised at some point whilst committing to a promise to Marcus, because she never had a spare moment after stepping back into being Hit Girl. Dave and the few heroes who respond to his call take 6 weeks to get a plan in motion. True to brand, they're immediately foiled before they can even get past the first gate, and that's their one and only attempt. No backup or resilience, but if it stops the boot revolving around Hit Girl, I'll accept it. It's quite true to the original concept though, that Dave can't just break her out, and had me wondering if Millar was wanting to ground the story again despite how off the rails it went in the second book. But speaking of that 6-week time jump, were there no repercussions of the Times Square brawl besides Hit Girl's arrest? As far as I can see, nearly all crime has just stopped during that time, because the first thing we see Dave do after his plan fails is pose for a brooding photo shoot at his father's grave, and this just feels wrong. Sure, he wants to live his superhero fantasy, but we saw him mock this very trope all the way back in Kick-Ass 1, and now your dead dad is just a backdrop after you got him killed? For as daft and cliched as he can be, Millar is betraying the heart of Dave for a cheap laugh, and we're barely a few pages in. Although, at least Millar does respect the passage of time here, and we follow Dave as he graduates, gets his first job, but still has that yearning to be Kick-Ass. It's quite a juxtaposition to where he was at the beginning of book 2, and he's kinda stepped into the leader role now, which comes with its own set of problems. There's a new member, the Juicer, who is freeloading on what has been left behind by Hit Girl, although Dave and the rest of the gang are technically doing the same, but unfortunately none of this was grabbing me. It's a shame that Mindy in prison was the only real thing that had been set up, and without that payoff, it does have to waste time figuring out what to do with the plot because there's nothing else to cash in on, except for that huge reveal back in Kick-Ass 2 that Dave's secret identity had been leaked over Twitter. How is this not the entire focus of Kick-Ass 3? Anytime a hero is exposed, that threatens the very core of what they're doing. How did Dave even manage to get a job without this coming up in a check? How has no one else come after him? Weren't the police under orders to arrest anyone in a costume? They all saw him on the rooftop after Chris fell. Surely they would want to at least bring him in for questioning. There's a scene later on where he's in costume at a restaurant so he can protect his identity, and I had to ask why. Did Millar really think this had no potential, or was it just too difficult to weave the story he wanted to tell around it? Instead of pushing the boat out and giving us something new, it falls into the same bland formula as before. We're introduced to Rocco Genovese, who is basically the same as every other leader of the crime family, but he has a nice pimp suit. Rocco has already become the target of Kick-Ass's gang, as they are desperate to send the message that Hit Girl being behind bars doesn't change anything. And to get the point across, Dave wants to do a Batman Year 1. That's not me summarising, he describes the plan as a Batman Year 1, as if plagiarising is only bad if you don't outright mention where you're stealing from. It's annoying too that this is overshadowing one of the most interesting subplots of the whole series. Angie Genovese's guilt. This near-Shakespearean storyline completely took me by surprise. As much as we've seen the public's opinion on Dave, I much preferred seeing how Chris's mum couldn't walk down the street anymore because of her son's actions, and how that guilt by association eats away at her, to the point where she convinces herself that the only option is to kill her son. This culminates with her saving Chris when the brother of Colonel Stars tries to kill him in his hospital bed. But honestly, if it wasn't for the work with Angie, I'd say the first quarter of this book could be skipped. Yeah, it's weird this is becoming a running theme for me ever since the X-Men Bendy's video, but why didn't Millar just start this at issue 3? Angie. The Angie stuff could have been thrown in somewhere as it's only a few pages, but then we'd have opened with Mindy already being in control of the prison, Kick-Ass leading his raid on Chris's freedom party, and it would have made the whole story flow better because of it. The way it is now, I can't believe that Mindy took over the whole prison in just 6 weeks if Dave can barely assemble a functional team in that time. How did less happen in the 6 months between book 1 and 2? The reason why this could work is because it would have reclaimed something it lost. Intrigue. As it stands, we're being shown absolutely everything to the point where the exciting moments feel overdue. Take that raid on Chris's party. Dave has done so little in the issues prior that it feels like he's scrambling to do something so he can be a hero. The only other time he's done anything as Kick-Ass was when he got ganged up on and had to be saved by Valerie. She's another aspect that would have benefited massively from us being thrown in at the deep end. The way she just appeared when Kick-Ass got jumped felt so staged that I spent the majority of this book wondering when she was going to betray him. I wanted to trust her, even though she's another character identical to Romita Jr.'s version of MJ. But because we were shown everything, I couldn't buy into her and Dave's relationship. Although the early moments that we did get with these two was nice. And there is that irony that when he was pursuing Katie, he was hiding behind a lie, and now with Valerie, he's hiding behind a mask. But the most interesting introduction to this couple could have been the moment that Dave revealed his identity to her. Especially since we don't get that scene at all. Yeah, I don't know if maybe Valerie just went on Twitter, but one scene he's with her at a diner in his Kick-Ass disguise, and the next, she's just fully aware of his whole secret. If we're forgetting that he was exposed in book 2, this should have been a huge moment. The first time he's let his guard down since his father's death, but that's robbed from us. There are at least 10 scenes in this book that were less interesting but still made the final cut. And if Millar wants us to think this relationship is important, show us these moments, rather than them having sex for the umpteenth time. There are still some story benefits to her being here, and I like how she's kinda Kick-Ass's kryptonite since he immediately slacks on hero work the second that they get together. And for as much as I've bagged on Kick-Ass 3 so far, once it had stalled out of the gate, there were a lot of interesting concepts coming out. Dave kicking the juicer out of the team was fun, and would have been enough just to see him dealing with the problems that come with being a leader, but it caused this weird rift that I didn't see coming. I didn't think anyone at the superhero HQ liked the juicer, but Millar did a great job of making us eager for Dave to give him the boot, and I asked myself if maybe Mark was gonna go back to his Civil War roots. For the first time since Red Mist was introduced, I was intrigued by the villains. Gigante and a few other crooked cops are fed up with how the mob are handling things and want to screw them over, but the only way to do it is to suit up! Not only is this a great concept that also feels like a natural progression for this world, but they act as a third faction between the heroes and the mob. Gigante's had a presence for so long now that I'm glad to see his storyline get some kind of payoff, and there's finally an antagonist other than a Genovese. His gang, the Skull and Bones crew, may be one of the smartest that Millar has made. They are this ideal moral grey area that I didn't realise earlier books had lost, and I got a kick out of how they pretended to be for a good cause and easily fooled the heroes. It makes sense that Gigante can pull this off since he's been playing both sides the entire time. And just like an early Kick-Ass, there's a great sense of cause and effect that elevates Rocco beyond the previous Genoveses. Because Skull and Bones posed as vigilantes, Rocco orders the execution of all heroes, with the likes of the Juicer and Dr. Gravity being killed and Todd being held hostage. This is enough to interrupt Dave's sex montage so that he can step back up as Kick-Ass for one last time. Unfortunately though, Dave can't do it alone, and so Millar needs to do some plot magic in order to get Mindy out of prison. Did Chris saving Mindy surprise me? Yeah, but did it make sense? God no. This is the penultimate issue, and Chris hasn't done anything besides go to a party that got raided. There's more development for his mum. As they're escaping the prison, Millar tries to frame it that the guilt got to him, and he hates how that has ruined his mum's life, but the only scene that we've had with these two is when she saves him in hospital. There's never been a moment where we saw Chris acknowledge the pain that he's inflicted on others. Damn, if Millar really wanted an easy way out, why not have Chris say he's saving Mindy to repay Dave for not letting him die at the end of book 2? Or how about showing remorse for murdering kids, raping Katie, or anything that would help me understand why he'd do a complete 180 and save the girl who killed his uncle and dad. That's the biggest tragedy in this concluding chapter. How much time it wasted. With just a few scenes here and there, some of the leaps in logic wouldn't have been so severe. Case in point, we could have removed one of the dozen Dave sex scenes and instead show us a scene of him promising Val that he's done with being Kick-Ass. That would have helped make sense of why she threatens to turn him into the police, because otherwise, what are we basing this off? She was only initially attracted to him because he was Kick-Ass, and since they got together, he's neglected crime fighting, but now she can't stand the thought of him doing it one last time to save Todd. This may be the only book I've read where it both needed to hurry up and also be given more time. I say that because this is the most underwhelming conclusion of the series, and I'm just gonna say it. The biggest problem is Hit Girl. From the moment she reunites with Dave, there is no tension. She picks up all of her gear, obliterates the entirety of Rocco's operation, and then gets snuck up on by Gigante, but still takes out every member of Skull and Bones because not a single one of them noticed that she'd littered bombs everywhere. At some point. How on earth did she plan for this? What if Gigante shot on sight since she'd just broken out of a maximum security prison? I thought in Book 2 she wouldn't run over Gigante because he was an officer. That's not changed. There were a lot of police at the arrest and they all got blown up, so were they all corrupt? Not a single one of them might be like Marcus. Could Dave have not done something to save her and finally flip this dynamic? Not even for the final battle? Even going back to the prison escape, we get possibly the biggest dose of Hit Girl bullshit. Chris crashes the car into a river because he's dying of a gunshot wound, yet Mindy uses the power of a childhood memory to escape a straitjacket, the water pressure, and still get Chris to shore, even though it's explicitly stated that she was injected with a sedative minutes before this. Why do sedatives have absolutely no effect in this world? Because of Mindy, I can't say if Miller did truly commit to the original concept of what would happen in reality, and in this final chapter it seems he abandoned that thought for Dave as well. Whilst Mindy's in God mode, Dave tracks down where Todd's being held. He took a monster truck there despite wanting the element of surprise and set up all the C4 perfectly. Now, I know this wants to end on a high note, but that's not the Kick-Ass I started with, and had this book not reached such a bottleneck at the end, it could have really switched things up if maybe Todd had been killed whilst Dave spent too long setting up the explosives, or perhaps he got caught in the blast because Dave isn't a tactical genius. We didn't see Dave observing the room, so how would he know that Todd was a safe distance away? But instead we have to rush through everything and the entire plan somehow works out, with Dave even getting his chance to rip off Batman Year 1. He also definitely murders a guy with a chainsaw. It's in self-defense, but still, this is the first official kill I can remember that Dave has committed, and instead of being traumatized or in shock, he's just chuffed that he beat the two guys. And no idea why he says beat, it's a bit of an understatement when you should be drowning in that one guy's brain juice. With a taste for blood, he electrocutes the remaining kidnappers, which he's immune to because of a padded suit, which they easily could have set up with the juicer, but didn't, so again, this all feels rushed and unearned. It's so rushed in fact that when Dave meets up with Valerie after the battle, she tells him it's like that scene in Spider-Man 2, instead of doing any of the legwork to have its own moment with the same kind of emotional depth. Can we all just start referencing a better version of the thing that we're doing? Should you keep watching this because I'm about to go on a legendary bedtime MMA rant? Or because I'm about to do a trademark H-Bomber guy switcheroo on you in a minute? Did me just saying those two names make this video any better? Miller probably thought that was okay because he couldn't close out Kick-Ass without one final, "Oh, you think it's going to be like this scene in a movie?" as Dave tells Valerie that he's closing the door on being Kick-Ass because now he's in love. I know I'm dumb, but all we've seen them do is shag, go to the cinema, and then shag some more. I could have sworn that they've been together for a month at best. It would have made more sense if the thought of killing someone else took him away from being a vigilante, but there hasn't been a single comment from Dave about that. Does Val even know that the love of her life is currently wearing some dude's brain goo? When thinking about the whole concept, and that idea of what if a teenager tried this in the real world, I think Miller only wanted to explore that from a physical perspective, because even the murder of his father didn't weigh on him for that long, and now he has no hang-ups over being a killer. I'm gonna channel me and a Dave again. Imagine if Superman had to kill someone and was happy as Larry in the next scene. Oh wait, we got that movie, it was dumb. There is quite a nice closing montage that I wish we could have had more time with. Like Marcus becoming captain, and Mindy and Chris's mums being best friends. They are scenarios that I would like to get the details of. But he finds a comfortable closure for Dave, as he joins the police force, and for his sake, I hope they never scan his DNA as he bled all over that vodka warehouse. We even get a homage to the opening scene, with a new winged hero atop a roof, but now they don't plummet to the death. And in a weird way, that feels symbolic for the change in direction of Kick-Ass. It doesn't feel realistic now, nor as mean-spirited as when it began, which unfortunately leaves Dave's story in this weird limbo where the edgy moments are more memorable than the story it told. Kick-Ass 3 in particular felt more like an obligation than a passion project, and maybe that's why it took so long to come out. Combine that with the movie series dying a quiet death, and how could there be any life left in the Kick-Ass IP? So if my goal in this video was to find out what the hell happened to Kick-Ass, I should be able to give you an answer now, but instead we just have another question. Why is this video not over yet? Okay, so the lack of a Kick-Ass 3 movie isn't as straightforward as there just not being one, and I didn't realise how much lore there was behind a movie that didn't exist. Going all the way back to April 2012, before the second movie had released, Millar mentioned that a third movie had been planned to close out this trilogy. Perhaps it was to hype things up, but Mark insinuated it could end with everyone dying, and heavily alluded to the fact that Dave likely wouldn't see the closing credits, and then made a baffling comparison that makes it sound like he thinks Superman has a bulletproof vest.
Bro, you've written Superman before.
As part of the promotional campaign for Kick-Ass 2, various cast and crew were asked about a threequel. Moritz was vocal about coming back, but solely on the basis that Matthew Vaughn returned to direct, and if they gave Hit Girl a purple Bugatti. And I think one of those demands are far more likely than the other. Vaughn himself was the most committed to the project, but with a busy 2014 that included directing both X-Men Days of Future Past and the first Kingsman movie, Kick-Ass 3 couldn't get off the ground. In 2015, he remarked that a third movie would start development in June of that year, with Johnson and Moritz reprising the roles and a Hit Girl prequel also being in the works. But whether it was a lack of funding, contract issues, or perhaps interest in the franchise fizzling out, Kick-Ass 3 still didn't happen, leading to things getting convoluted. So Matthew Vaughn owned the movie rights to Kick-Ass, but due to the complications it had getting out of the gate, it had to be licensed to different companies depending on the territory. This left new projects in a state of limbo, which got even more complicated in 2017 when Netflix brought the Miller World comic imprint, which Kick-Ass is a part of but wasn't included in the deal. But then, in 2021, Vaughn revealed the rights will revert back to Marvel Studios, his production company, within 2 years. Plans were rumoured, with there even being news that Vaughn would launch a shared universe with Kick-Ass and Marvel's other Miller project, Kingsman. But during this time, it felt like any Kick-Ass news only existed to contradict whatever the previous news was. Word of a reboot caught attention, but with Patience Lee being the main character instead of Dave. But the sequels for this vague movie would have Johnson and Moritz reprising the roles. Kevin Smith lobbied for a spin-off, Hit Girl in Hollywood, to be the basis for a standalone Hit Girl movie, but set within the same world as the earlier Kick-Ass franchise. Then, one of the biggest gaslighting attempts in cinema history happened, because in January 2024, Matthew Vaughn announced that Stunt Nuts Does School Fight had completed filming, and was the secret third installment to Kick-Ass, and also the first in a new trilogy of Kick-Ass movies. I'm surprised it wasn't also announced to be Half-Life 3, Cure Cancer, and Solve World Hunger. The movie follows a group of teen athletes who look to become stuntmen so that their school gym can be kept open. Where exactly Kick-Ass factors into that, I have no idea, unless it's like that weird American Psycho sequel and it just occasionally name drops characters that you might know. The cast list only has 5 names, none of which were in the previous Kick-Ass movies, that range from unknowns that don't even have a Wikipedia page, all the way up to Sam Rockwell and Chris Hemsworth. It says the appearance themselves, which leads me to believe that they might not even know they're in this. I might start doing that in my videos. Stay tuned! Michael B. Jordan's going to be in this one. Originally, it was intended to debut at the 2024 Toronto Film Festival, and then the 2025 Sundance Film Festival. But I'm just going to say, there is no way this movie's real. Am I honestly expected to believe that Vaughn didn't let anything slip up until it was already finished? It's been 2 years since it was completed and it hasn't been shown anywhere. Nor had a trailer, not even had a single set photo leak despite having one of the biggest A-listers in all of Hollywood in it. It's just giving that same energy as when FuziTube organised that show and convince people that Drake would be there. God, it's really difficult to switch off that inner Dave once it gets going. I would love to be proven wrong and for this to be real, and to relaunch everything Kick-Ass, but the way Vaughn's revealed everything had me wondering if maybe he was gauging if the demand would be there for a new Kick-Ass. Or else I think we would have seen anything from this. Do you know how hard it'll be editing this bit when there is absolutely zero footage to use? I don't even know what I'm gonna put here. There hasn't even been low effort AI slop of this Stunt Nuts movie. That's how non-existent it is. So, long story short, there's no Kick-Ass 3, there may be a new Kick-Ass movie that's not about Kick-Ass, but is also secretly Kick-Ass and no one's seen a single frame of it. But given my track record, something major will be announced about this movie the day before I upload this, just so that I can look like an idiot. That should sound like the end of this story, but some of you may still be wondering, who's that Patience Lee that I mentioned? There is one question that's guided this video. What the hell happened to Kick-Ass? But for context, That wasn't even a thought in my head until I learned about the comic relaunch in 2018. This was a time when I wasn't following comic news, so I had no idea this happened. I never realized Kick-Ass had this whole second life, and was gobsmacked when I learned that both Millar and Romita Jr. returned for it. When interviewing with Entertainment Weekly in the build-up to the release, Millar said this had been an idea that he wanted to write for a while, and that he'd always thought of Kick-Ass as a legacy character, destined to have the mantle passed on like James Bond or Doctor Who. And I know right now you probably expect me to stop the music so I can make a big claim to the contrary, but I think he's telling the truth. Sure, this was coming out during the time of Marvel now, when it seemed like a lot of titles were replacing legacy characters in favour of more politically acceptable heroes. I had to word it that way. People from both sides of the argument get offended way too easily. So it's easy to think that Millar was just jumping on the same bandwagon with his most well-known IP and passing it off as the plan all along. But there was a part of Kick-Ass 3 that I didn't mention. After the credits and even the creator bios, Hit Girl breaks into the bedroom of Paul McHugh and recruits him to be the next Kick-Ass. So even the original concluding chapter showed the mantle being passed on, but that's not who we're following here. Sure, there were a handful of Hit Girl story arcs released around the same time that I think includes this Paul kid, but I don't want to read them. They just have the same feeling as those direct-to-DVD American Pie movies that will always have none of the main cast, except for one, and it'll be someone like Jim's dad. Seriously, can someone help me switch off this inner Dave? But the idea with a meta comic series tackling the concept of legacy characters got me interested enough to see what was going on with this relaunch. We open on Kick-Ass, captured and being dragged to the feet of Bronco, the crime kingpin of New Mexico. The mask is pulled off and it's not a skinny white kid. Well, I'm just gonna say, I don't know I'm supposed to relate if I don't feel represented by the main character. That was a bit of playful banter, don't take it too seriously. This is Patience Lee, a former soldier who retired from a decorated career on the front lines of Afghanistan so that she can return home to her family and study engineering. Except that the father of her kids left while she was overseas so that he could pursue his music career, leaving her broke, desperate for work, and scrambling to pay off the debt that he racked up in her name while she was gone. There's no other option because she can't get a security job because of Trump. For some reason, which I really hope isn't going to be her equivalent to Dave's pop culture references, but it means the only choice is crime. The immediate strength of this story is giving us a character the near polar opposite of Dave. She isn't doing this for moral reasons, but at the same time she's tried everything else. Life has repeatedly kicked her while she's down, so there's more than enough in this first issue to justify her actions. There's not that naive optimism of a teenage comic fan, it's the harsh reality of a single parent whose world crashed down around her, so Millar chose the best protagonist to make this feel new. But what doesn't make sense is why she chose the Kick-Ass outfit. I get why she opts for vigilante getup. In fact, her reasoning behind every part of the plan is done so that no one would ever connect it back to her, and I love that, but the reason for her using Dave's disguise in particular feels more so that Millar can call this a Kick-Ass book rather than it being anything to do with Patience. If a reason really was because she wanted everyone to think it was some crazed comic fan, surely it would be easier to get a Spider-Man, Batman, or any recognizable hero costume since it's clear they exist in this universe. However, despite going into this thinking it was a cheap rip-off of a once successful IP, I really enjoyed this opening. It was refreshing to see the Kick-Ass trope be reversed and have the capture be part of Patience's plan to get into Bronco's office. It's almost as if the time away made Millar remember what the concept originally promised. What if someone tried this in the real world? It's not about ushering in a movement across the country, but a single mum pushed to a limit and using the only option she has left. And reducing the scale back down is what made this far more enjoyable. There are greater stakes in the one fight we get here than there were in the entirety of the Times Square showdown, but Patience can bring her army training with her, so fights feel fresh and dynamic, and not just a 16-year-old getting beaten to a pulp every time. I am still wary though that this could slip into the Hit Girl formula of making Patience impossible to beat, but it makes far more sense that she can win fights compared to a 12-year-old who was trained by her untrained dad. But where this story really grabbed me was in how Patience doesn't want to be a superhero, she accidentally becomes one. There's this constant push-pull similar to what Dave experienced with his lack of ability, but this time with the morality of it all. She just wants to pay the bills, but at the same time doesn't feel right stealing money, so donates half of what she takes to local charities. And already, early on, it had me asking, is she doing that because she wants to, or because she wants to clear her conscience? So I wanted to keep reading to see if she'd stick to this rule, especially because Millar gives us balance. As soon as she's done robbing Bronco, we see her treat her kids, get her life together, attends school and not just wanting to fight crime again. There's a greater reason why she's doing this, so the slower moments of her personal life add to the overall plot, rather than feeling like a quick way to get a few cheap laughs or references in. Millar commits to the voice. She isn't Dave 2.0, but the only area where that's a negative is how tech and social media aren't incorporated like they were in the original. She's oddly a pensioner, and her time overseas must have involved some items she could bring into this new line of work. But it's been 10 years since Dave went viral on YouTube, and used MySpace to locate crime, so why can't we see how that would evolve? If she really needs money, why not touch on this whole membership culture that's going on? I'm not saying she should launch an OnlyFans, but something of that similar ilk, and let her build a fan base that way. That would have been a really interesting idea and showed how technology's evolved since the original Kick-Ass. And who knows, maybe her members could have gotten a shout out like my one member's gonna do right now. Yeah, I'm talking about you, Al_Hutch. Thank you, man. I forgot to set that up, so I really appreciate the support. Bare minimum, she could use a VPN so she doesn't need a physical map anymore. Although, I'll take it, because one of the best parts of this story was seeing her planning, the logic behind her decisions, and how she tries to rectify mistakes from previous hits. Her second take is more low-key. She gets a driver rather than the big boss, and coming from the conveyor belt to Gina Vessi's, this is a welcome breath of fresh air. The time we had with her surveying a target to pick up on the patterns was a corner of this lifestyle I was intrigued to see. It brings back the unfamiliarity, so when she has a near miss, only saved by the blood in a target's eyes, that is an intensity we haven't seen since Hit Girl was introduced. But I'm gonna say, this should have been called Breaking Ass. Are you telling me that the Albuquerque location about a down-on-the-luck parent with huge untapped potential getting into a life of crime is in no way inspired by Walter White? It's even got the brother-in-law connection, since Maurice works for a crime boss called Hoops and is deeply connected to the world that Patience is now targeting. And honestly, that was enough of a hook to keep me invested, but Millar just can't help being Millar. To even the odds, Hoops brings Violencia onto his team, a hitman so powerful that he can break out of prison just because he's bored. And all of the hard work to get out of the gimmick zone is obliterated by him. He's someone that would be far-fetched if the Punisher went after him, and was the first real immersion break after Millar had done so much good work. As well, he could have been a cut character from the Dave series, because of course, the pointless references are back. Patience finds a warehouse that operates as a front, and breaks in to find where Hoops was throwing a breakout party for Violencia. The policeman who arrested him was being held hostage, but just as Kick-Ass is about to save him, the entire gang confronts her. Maurice was there, which made the situation tense enough and should have been the focal point, but that's second fiddle to Violencia, who wants a gimmick, so he just loudly admits that he's gonna steal Two-Face's coin flip. Again, just because you say you're stealing doesn't make it okay. Whereas so, it was just name dropping, as Violencia doesn't obey the coin, and none of it was needed because the components of a great story were already there. Kick-Ass was face to face with Maurice and Hoops. They should be the villain of that moment. Show us how brutal a brother-in-law can be, and it would have made the fallout all the more severe, because Patience has to think on her feet. She's not another Mindy where she can plan for a scenario there is no way that she'd be able to predict. She rattles through a dozen possibilities before remembering the party balloons were filled with hydrogen instead of helium, as the guy who did it wanted to save money. Although in that case, just blowing into them would have been far more cost effective. But Patience can use this to cause an explosion, save the hostage and escape, but at the cost of Maurice being hospitalized. You see, take out Violencia and this would have had even more of an impact. It would mean that we'd lose the batshit crazy escape though, so I'm gonna have to be a bit of a hypocrite, because the scene of her driving away but trying to get Violencia off the car was easily one of the best of this first arc. She crashes into a high-end car dealership, but when she notices there aren't any alarms, I for sure thought this was owned by one of the gangs. So for as much as I enjoyed it, I was a bit confused by the ending. Overall, it still played out really well. I never cared about Maurice, but I do care about how it affects Patience, and the delivery of this information was handled perfectly. We're so distracted by her covering up her tracks that we learn about Maurice at the same time as Patience and get to connect those dots for ourselves. It made me feel dumb for believing that she'd gotten out of this without a catch. This is her Eddie Lomas moment where the reality of her actions bleeds into her personal life, but it forces her to go deeper into the vigilante lifestyle, as now she has to pay for medical bills and help out her sister Edwina. So there's already more than enough on her plate, but Millar then gives us one of my favourite villains in all of Kick-Ass, Mr. Solo. Is he just a rip-off of L from Death Note? Yeah, and I'm not even a manga guy but can still tell you that. However, he is still the perfect foil for Patience, and if you're openly stealing ideas from existing properties, you might as well take from the best. He's a logic consultant, someone you hire to find solutions to unsolvable problems, and in just one conversation with Hoops, narrows down everything they know about Kick-Ass to deduce who she is. There isn't that Dr. Manhattan omnipotence going on again, just reason and deduction, except when it comes to the final step. They realise she had a burner phone, but no calls were made from it, but plenty were made to it. So you're telling me that patients went through all this effort to cover her tracks, but slipped up by giving her mom the number to a burner phone? Is that not the point of a burner phone in the first place? Could she not have just hidden a regular phone somewhere, since she didn't answer the call until after she was done as Kick-Ass anyway? The introduction of Mr. Solo was still great, but how it took such a leap at the last step reminded me of the laziness that cropped up in the original series. And unfortunately, I was kinda lying there, because this meeting with Hoops wasn't our introduction to Solo, which is where my other biggest pet hate of the series rears its ugly head. Cartoonish villains. I spoke about it with Violencia, but it seeps into the other antagonists too. Hoops is a stereotype to the point where the only interesting thing about him is that he runs the crime empire. Everything else is so textbook that you'd think I'm describing someone from a different book. And when we first meet Solo, he's in bed with an escort, with him being all like, "Hey you, sex my dick." Just so you know that he's a man of power like every other villain that we've seen. It's funny, I thought I was going to read the boys after this, not right now. As well, if you want me to think your character is a dumbass, make sure their opening monologue is them telling us how smart they are, because that's what we were given with Solo, and it's so fortunate he could turn it around after this scene. Although I don't get why he'd feel so confident to reference Superman if he doesn't even know who Lois Lane is. You see what I mean about that opening monologue working against him? He came across as far more in control in the scene with Hoops, and this should have been his introduction. The less we know about him, the more terrifying he'd be. We wouldn't know his next move, so when he does immediately assemble a team to go to Patience's house, we'd be even more off guard since we'd only seen him once before. This is what I meant by him being her perfect foil. She's been so on point about covering her tracks that you need someone who can dig them back up and go after the very reason why she got into this to begin with. Her children, and that's one parallel between her and Dave that I loved, and I never realised just how well done it was in the original. They both have an enemy that knows how to neutralise them. That's why I wasn't so bothered when it looked like the climax was identical to the first Kick-Ass, because I knew it would play out differently. She's blindsided, captured, and taken to a remote location so that she can be beaten and killed by everyone she's ripped off. At first I thought, here we go, another gratuitous torture scene for shock value, but we aren't following Dave anymore. The brief moment early on of her learning to pick locks is a lifeline here, and everything I thought I knew about Kick-Ass had flipped on its head. She breaks free of her handcuffs and decimates everyone in her path, and then not being a hit girl-like character that needs to bail her out of every problem just made me love Patience even more. We finally have a competent yet believable protagonist. If anything, Millar did Patience a disservice by naming this Kick-Ass. This story is great in its own right, but people like myself probably wrote it off because it feels like it's piggybacking off the legacy, and we still haven't been given a real explanation why she chose his disguise. Dare I say, this was a better Kick-Ass story than Kick-Ass. It knows when to obey the formula and when to switch it up, rather than always looking to subvert expectations for shock value. Although, I do wish there was a greater weakness with it. I don't want Dave levels of incompetence again, but beyond having kids, what's her kryptonite? She's too ideal of a protagonist. All of her intentions are pure, even when she gets her criminal brother-in-law injured. And that one brief glimpse of toxicity where she considers taking more to cover her bills is promptly shooed away so that we're left with, oh wait, this ends with her declaring herself as the head of crime? I am fucking in. What on earth was I doing when this first released? Why did no one tell me to read this before? Everything that was promised from the original Kick-Ass was here, and I never knew. The problem with Dave's journey is that he always wanted to go bigger rather than deeper. He got lost in the fantasy of being a hero, whereas Patience is corrupted by the reality. And when she stakes a claim and recruits the criminals that wanted to kill her just minutes before, I'm forced to wonder, is she doing this because she thinks it's the only way she can take down crime? Or has she become lost along the way and become the thing she wanted to stop? It wasn't perfect, but this is easily the most excited I've been about where a book could go in a good long while. Even Romita Jr. doesn't draw like the same artist that I've repeatedly bashed from around this time. The way the flashback scenes have a more pasteled, unclear look to them makes it visually more exciting, and the way that the violence is less in your face yet more detailed at the same time just gives it this fresh take. So with everything about this relaunch off to a great start and nothing but possibilities in the future, where would Millar take Kick-Ass? Wait, what? Millar left after the first 6 issues? Have you ever worn someone else's shoes? That's how I imagine Steve Niles must have felt when he took over the writing duties of Kick-Ass, despite being a top-tier talent in his own right with 30 Days a Night. From the interviews I can find, the creative switchover was due to time constraints for Miller, as he moved into an executive role when Netflix bought Millarworld, but Niles made the smartest choice from the second he took over, and worked with what he was given. Part of me did worry that everything would be undone to position the story where it suits a new writer best. You know, Bendy's style. It's been a few months since Patience took over Hoops's territory, and has slowly been targeting rival gangs to bring some form of order to the crime world. She's found a fragile rhythm with the criminals who sided with her, and at the same time she tries to do the right thing by protecting victims. Do I think there were probably some fascinating stories within those few months that could have been told? Sure, seeing the teething problems of Patience becoming a crime lord sounds great, but at the same time, moving things forward allows there to be a level of intrigue, and avoids a slow start like what we had in Kick-Ass 3.
Although, I have to admit, her kids got over the trauma of being held up at gunpoint in their own home remarkably quick. I had a pretty aggressive window salesman come to the door 3 weeks ago and I'm still scared to answer.
One thing I'm not too sure about is the art by through scene. Sometimes it's great, especially when we're following Patience in a civilian life, and it has an element similar to Sean Phillips or Eduardo Risso, and I was surprised to find out that Risso and Frusin are both from Argentina, but especially when the action is taking place, it just looks rushed and lacking detail, and body proportions look off. Who'd have ever thought there'd be a day that I'd wish Romita Jr was still on a title? Like, Violencia comes back into the story, but at first, I thought this was a Fallout ghoul because what is going on here? That goes for his whole reintroduction scene, because the storytelling in the prison gym felt like I was reading storyboards rather than being told a story. There's also a weird thing going on where you can clearly tell who the inspiration is. I'll pull them up as they appear, but straight away, this guy's Clint Eastwood. This is Wallace, the right-hand man of Hector Santos, who is the head of the cartel and repeatedly hearing about Kick-Ass targeting his operation. Because he knows where his gangs are, he stages an ambush, and it's far more intense now they are coming after her than before when she was the hunter. Again, I like how often a character influences the story, because her time in the army is the only reason she isn't killed. And I can't believe I didn't mention this before, but her already being comfortable killing solves a lot of problems. It's not something that has to be a sticking point like it was for Dave, or disappointing when it's glossed over. Again, like it was for Dave. I don't know how it manages to toe this line so well, but when the action happens, it still has a vigilante feel, rather than purely gang warfare, and it's so intriguing to see it pull that off and make Patience an outsider in this environment. Early on, I kept wondering how long she'd keep herself at the front of everything, since everyone else has people do the dirty work for them. Much like with Miller, the stakes are there early on. We said before that Niles doesn't abandon what came before, which is why I like that Maurice being in a coma doesn't mean he's out of the picture. In fact, it allows Edwina to become more of a character, which makes the dilemma all the more complicated. On paper, there is no reason to want Maurice to live. He is no different than the god knows how many criminals she's already killed, but because we see the knock-on effect it's having, it falls into more of a grey area. It's continuing to be breaking ass, because Patience telling Edwina to turn off the life support machine is solely her speaking as Kick-Ass. Like, look at this face. She looks like me when anyone starts telling me a story about the kid. Sure, she'd still be feeling the financial burden, but her life would be much easier if Maurice wasn't in the picture. In fact, it's the financial side of things that keeps getting more difficult now. It's odd how defiant she is to not take more money when it's purely to cover her bills. Yeah, she initially promised herself she wouldn't, but I bet she also promised that she wouldn't join up with the criminals, and look where we are. It's such an odd sticking point that feels a bit too contrived considering how her situation's changed. She's now giving the criminals that she was trying to kill more money than she's given herself. And there would still be enough going on here if she did decide to take more money, so I don't get why that is often her biggest problem. And if I'm honest, Patience has far too many hours in the day. So she's Kick-Ass, a mum to multiple kids, waitressing full-time, going to college, where she makes the Power Rangers mistake of wearing the same colours as her alter ego out in public, probably has homework, paying bills, offline for some reason, and running to the hospital anytime Maurice's catheter is full. For as much as the financial strain is positioned as a main problem, they should have also toyed with how much she has to do unless she's having like 2 hours sleep. Bizarrely though, Patience is the only one immune to time. Ironic given a name, but for example, Maurice doesn't just immediately wake up as soon as the machine is switched off. It's a slow burn for the book, something to be constantly aware of whilst the main plot moves forward, and it's a welcome change from Dave waiting around for a crime to happen. He's the ticking time bomb that as soon as he comes to, there will be a greater problem for Patience. Meanwhile, Wallace has infiltrated Kick-Ass's crew and sent the message that the cartel will get her. Despite how big the cartel is, she wages war, throwing money at a gang until they find a lead, and when they do, Kick-Ass walks right up to Wallace and I never know where this story will go. So I fully cackled out loud and startled my cat in the process when she sat at Wallace's table and he just stabbed her in the hand and walked off. Finally, it's subverting things in ways that aren't predictable and constantly puts Patience in these predicaments where I want to see how she'll escape. Her ambush got ambushed and Niles incorporates that vibe that if she makes one wrong move, it's over for her. She's competent, sure, but still vulnerable, and it's her ego that's often a downfall. She can't just walk into a public restaurant and get caught up in a gunfight without drawing police attention. The rules aren't the same here as they were in Afghanistan, and I'm glad her ability to adapt didn't leave with Millar. Being Kick-Ass is like a disease for Patience. The longer it goes on, the more it bleeds into her personal life, and one of the parts that I enjoyed most was how she made excuses to sneak about or blag her way past a doctor to get her injury seen to. Her lying to her sister and losing her job because she kept missing shifts to be Kick-Ass was far more engaging than days sleeping through class. Although Patience is guilty of that too, and there is something to be said about how her success as a leader contrasts the struggles in her personal life. She handles an ambush better than a conversation with an old friend, and in parts it reminds me of the Hurt Locker, especially when she harkens back to being a Night Stalker, and it just looks like she brought the war back home with her. So despite my reservation at someone other than Millar writing Kick-Ass, I was still loving this. Until Violencia came back as the Juggernaut for some reason. So Patience breaks into Wallace's house, cuts off his hand as payback, and finds out where Santos lives. But he's prepared for this and believes that the enemy of his enemy is his friend. For some reason, Patience doesn't predict that Wallace would warn Santos, and walks directly into a trap where she's cornered by... Wait, why are we always being shown her ass? I ain't complaining, it's a great ass, but it's a bit much. Like I'm trying to see what's going on in the panel, but it takes over. It's just fortunate that I've already been tempted twice already in this video because I'm in my 30s, and if I hadn't have emptied the sack twice already, I would have... This fight did highlight another way that her two lives contrast each other because she can think on the fly as Kick-Ass. If this was Mindy, she'd have been able to punch her way through the armor and kill him without a challenge. But Patience recognizes that punching Violencia will just break her hand, so instead she uses the knowledge of what she's seen at the house to lure him towards the pool and drown him. It's a great plan, and I love how Niles keeps giving us new situations but still finding believable solutions. Even more so when she escapes the compound and is confronted by Santos and his men. He'd already had all of Patience's crew killed, so I thought this was going to lead to another chapter where she's taken to some warehouse and given time to escape. But no, with guns aimed at her and facing certain death, Patience somehow convinces Santos' men to kill him instead, which if you're Santos, you have to kind of respect. You know, for the 30 more seconds that you're living. Although I don't think it's wholly believable, it's still better than there being a random last minute save from someone else. And the only other wrinkle that I can think of causing Patience a problem would be if the police were more involved. I know it's harsh to judge a story on what it doesn't include, but vigilantism, crime, and the police go hand in hand. It was a key part of the original Kick-Ass story with Marcus, and even when it was just alluding to a manhunt for Dave. So with how Patience has these unbreakable morals, if there was a detective or officer-like character on a trail, but she refused to kill them because of her morality, that would be a far more interesting dynamic than her just refusing to take from a big pile of money, especially since Maurice sort of that character, but I just fully want her to kill him. Yep, he's awake now, and drastically overvalues how important he is. He wants Patience to hand over the territory that she's taken over, which is something he didn't even control when he was at full strength, but now thinks he can handle from a hospital bed. And how did he even know the takeover had happened? Sure, it was dumb of me to think that his demand would just be money, since the only person that Patience is penny pinching with is herself. But the second that he told her to give up the territory, she should have turned off all the machines. There are so many ways she could kill him and have it look like an accident. What threat does he pose here? He'll expose her? So what? Say he's lying, the dude's been in a coma for months. I've never seen anyone with less bargaining power make such a big move, and there is zero logic behind Patience agreeing. This is like me demanding a raise at work after they wake me up from a mid-shift nap. He even has the audacity to tell Patience to go after the Ivanov brothers, the Russians who look to reclaim what Santos lost. But he must have amnesia because she's already taken out a few of the men before they even had this conversation. What's next? Are you gonna warn her that Wallace might stab her in the hand? By the way, she recovered remarkably well from that, and for as much as I enjoyed what Niles was doing, there would be odd continuity errors like that. Another one is how she magically got a job at the diner back. She was clearly sacked over the phone, and I even went back over the pages to see if this was explained, and the next time her job is even mentioned, she's trying to bail again. And when I think about why, it's clear this corner is being cut to allow for two story beats. Firstly, Frankie, the guy who left her to pursue his music, is back, and tricked Ed Weiner into seeing his kids. Great scene, it was like a better version of when Dave sorted out the thugs at the cinema, or earlier in the series when Patience saw that gang by a car. She's had so little benefit from being Kick-Ass that seeing her storm home and immediately punch Frankie was a welcome sight. Patience at the start of the book would have tried to make things work, but despite the hardship, she has built a life for her family, and he can't just take it back. She's also at the diner again because it gives Coop another reason to be here. I hadn't mentioned him earlier, but he's the love interest that she knew from her time in Afghanistan, and Niles does a far better job in establishing their chemistry than Millar ever did for Dave and Valerie. But it's almost the opposite of that problem, because he is genuinely just waiting to be the love interest. He shows up enough to remind you that he's still here, and will be the perfect guy eventually, but the plot doesn't need that right now. And I don't want to be too much of a conspiracy theorist, but it feels like two separate stories are being told at once. The sales for issue 1 when Millar came back were pretty much the same as when it launched in 2008, just shy of 50,000 copies, and ranked within the top 20 for that month, which was great. But when Millar left, it wasn't even in the top 100, and seemed lucky if it shipped 15,000 units the longer it went on. So I wonder if Niles knew that the writing was on the wall and didn't want to leave anything out, which is respectable but makes for a slapdash reading experience. Because whilst Patience is dealing with Maurice's blackmail and the Ivanov brothers, we're also introduced to Cortez, who is clearly Danny Trejo, and I could have sworn the family in Spy Kids was called Cortez, so in my headcanon, it's the same guy. And we're not properly told what his deal is, just that he's annoyed by Kick-Ass and calls in Rosa. Meanwhile, a group of women somehow find Kick-Ass's warehouse and want to fight alongside it as they were rescued by her earlier in the series. They work great together, but one of them is killed whilst hunting down the Ivanov brothers before I even learned a name. Also, tensions are running high in Kick-Ass's gang, as the men don't agree with destroying the drugs that they confiscate, and this threatens the very fragile ecosystem that relies solely on money, something Maurice is now affecting with his blackmailing. But that's okay, because someone kills all the men in Kick-Ass's group before they could even have an argument about it, and calls her out for a showdown. Patience goes, but is confronted by Rosa. Do you see now what I mean about it trying to tell too much at once? But the solution feels obvious. Get rid of either Cortez or the Ivanovs, since they both serve the same purpose. They are yet another ruthless crime boss. And I don't want to say that my earlier idea about an antagonist working within the law would have solved this and made it feel fresh. You might think it, but I won't say it. But neither Cortez or the Ivanovs are that interesting or better than what we've been given before. You know, besides one of them looking like Danny Trejo, but that's an easy way to win favour. If it was so determined on carrying on this crime gang angle and connecting it to how Patience brought the war zone she left behind back home with her, then just retcon Maurice a little bit. Before I start, no. I have never written a comic before, so my opinion is worth less than nothing here. But in the months after Patience took over Hoops' territory, what if she was doing a bad job? What if things didn't work the way she wanted them to because she's working with criminals instead of soldiers? What would happen if the money dried up because they aren't any good at this? Or if her refusing to sell drugs turned out to be the only way that they can make money? And then when Maurice wakes up, it turns out that he was the one who ran Hoops' operation but never got the credit. What if he told Patience that he could run things from the hospital bed, bring the money back in, but she had to work for him? Then not only would this clear up the swamp of interchangeable crime bosses, it would give a bulletproof reason why she couldn't kill Maurice and solve that whole problem. And more than anything, it would give us something different. I don't know how you'd get out of that scenario without Patience having to either kill Maurice or betray a moral code. Now look me in the eyes and tell me that doesn't sound more interesting than a final act where two new figureheads from different gangs are trying to kill her and she'll somehow find a way to win. If that was the story they went with, the only thing I'd hope could still find a way in here is Rosa. She is exactly what the earlier series was desperately trying to make with Violencia, and was easily the most exciting part of the Niles era. I call their fights the battle of tits and ass, as where Patience has her cheeks pointing at us in every panel, that's what Rosa's boobs are. Seriously, look at any page with her in, they're always front and centre, and even a close-up shot has at least one of the gals in the frame. You have no idea how happy I am that I've already been tempted 3 times in this video, so I'm not gonna get caught off guard and give in to temptation again. Okay, maybe I'll need 2 minutes this time. Perhaps it was because things already felt a bit rushed, but I was expecting more from this first confrontation with Rosa. Maybe it could have even ended with her forcing Patience to retreat. But this is someone who found Kick-Ass's headquarters and killed most of her men just to be beaten fairly easily in a one-on-one fight. So when the next time we see her as her approaching the Russians for a team-up, I wasn't excited, especially because it didn't amount to anything. The very next scene with the Russians, Kick-Ass targets their obvious Breaking Bad ripoff lab, then immediately goes to the club where the Ivanovs are and takes them out, so what was the point of Rosa forming an alliance? It's rushing through things so quickly that it feels more like a top-down PC game where you have to build an army and claim territory than it is an actual story that we're supposed to be invested in. All of this adds to my theory that the series was at risk of being cancelled, because the final issue is so bizarrely paced and doesn't do any of the plot's justice. Despite getting the cliffhanger that Frankie's pressing charges against Patience, this has zero bearing on the story. Coop magically reappears after he tried to kiss her a few nights ago but got rejected, and Patience forgives him because she needs someone to look after the kids, and also promised to look after the kids if she dies, which barely prompts a question, let alone a discussion out of Coop. Maurice reaches out to Rosa and sells out Patience in exchange for ownership over the Albuquerque territories once she's out of the picture. For some reason they agree, despite the fact that Maurice has never controlled an operation, so I have no idea why Cortez would put him in charge when he's still in the hospital. Kick-Ass assembles as many criminals as she can in a war against Cortez that started out of left field, but none of them are there besides the side chicks when Rosa blindsides her. They have the quickest final fight of all time, like, I owe the 2017 Power Rangers movie an apology now because of this. The side chicks are all killed as well, just to make sure that they don't need to be developed, and Patience makes a beeline for the hospital in a Kick-Ass get-up and suffocates Maurice with a pillow. Did that feel like a rushed synopsis? Do you just think I skimmed over everything because I've been on this section for a while now? Well, you might have a point on the second one, but that's how reading this issue felt. It's annoying too because the ending positions it as if Maurice was the big bad of the arc, which he easily could have been, and it would have improved this story immensely. Instead, it plays out in a way that just brings up the same question. Why didn't you kill him as soon as he started blackmailing you? It's not like he was decent to Patience up until that point and the betrayal came as a surprise, so she should have killed him earlier and most of her problems would have been solved. At least we can say that is resolved because there is so much from this series that's forgotten. Santos? Coop? The revelation that at some point Patience organised all of the crime in Albuquerque? The charges filed by her ex-husband? Hell, we don't even get to see Edwina's reaction to Maurice being killed, or how Patience finesses her way out of that. That's because instead of it being a finale for this series, it's set up for the next. We're in Hong Kong, where the news is covering the story about how Kick-Ass has appeared once again in Albuquerque. Two questions. Would anything that has happened with Patience have even made it past local news? Why would China care about a battle with the cartel that didn't even leave New Mexico? And also, did they really think this was the same Kick-Ass as the one from New York? They saw the images and thought, yeah, that's Dave Lizewski. Really? There's not even one very obvious difference between the two? Okay, let's not beat around the bush. I don't want to be cancelled or seen a certain way, but let's be realistic here. Dave never had glutes like that. This far-fetched coincidence only exists because at that very moment, on the other side of the world, Hit Girl just happens to be watching the news. Thank God she wasn't busy doing anything else whilst they briefly reported on this, or else we wouldn't get Kick-Ass vs Hit Girl. Now, for as contrived as this setup was, I'm excited for Patience's storyline to cross over with the original, even if it's through a character that I got tired of. We needed something to connect these two dots, and hopefully this is it. Does it feel like an easy way to ignite some hype in the franchise again? Sure, but the Niles era of Kick-Ass was overall quite strong, so it was something else that must have caused a dip in sales. Sometimes a title just doesn't move the copies it should, through no one's fault, so why not throw Hit Girl into the mix and hopefully give Patience a boost? She's older now as well, so hopefully she's grown out of a plot armor. Besides, it's sort of a blessing to not know what Hit Girl's been up to because I'm interested to see where she's at, and if I had read a spin-off then...
You can't avoid it. Reading her spin-off is inevitable.
Come on, is it really going to change how I feel about the Kick-Ass franchise?
Probably not, but if you don't read it, it's the only thing people will bring up in the comments.
This better be worth it. Time for another confession. I didn't know Hit Girl had been given her own multi-arc series until I was deep into reading the new Kick-Ass book. This feels like it should have been the bigger title between the two, but despite both launching within a month of each other, all of the press went towards Kick-Ass, where Millar went into interviews about how the story of Patience was one that he'd been compelled to write. Hit Girl just seem to fill up a publishing slot. And this is where another one of my probably wrong theories comes into play. So, Millarworld is both the umbrella name for all of Mark Millar's creator-owned titles, but is also an actual company that Netflix bought in August 2017. However, despite being under that umbrella, Kick-Ass nor Hit Girl are owned by Netflix. So even if Netflix wouldn't benefit financially from a new Kick-Ass or Hit Girl comic launching, the brand of Millarworld would, especially with how many adverts were in the back of every single issue of Kick-Ass and Hit Girl. The reason that I think this is because Millar once again left after the first story arc. So I don't know about you, but the plan to me seemed to be bring the creator back for authenticity, bask in the initial hype, and hope that the reader sticks around for everything else. That might sound like a conspiracy theory, but the timing of everything is far too convenient for both Kick-Ass and Hit Girl to be passion projects for Millar. The executive role excuse was used again, but he still had time to write all the other Millarworld books, but the only ones he couldn't continue with are his two most well-known IPs. We open in Colombia, where a local hitman known as Mano is being transported to prison after being handed 10 life sentences. But the convoy is ambushed, leaving nothing but unconscious guards and a hole in the ground, which is where we find Mindy. She's going after all the gangs in Colombia, and knows that Mano is the quickest way to do that because he is part of the Perros de Guerra gang, and everyone on Mindy's list are their rivals. She gives him access to all of her weaponry, and the two hit the streets, but you might be wondering, what about that Paul kid from the end of Kick-Ass 3? Well, we get a flashback to a month earlier in Pittsburgh, which means that this whole thing in Colombia is likely taking place in the same season as Kick-Ass 3. Just something to keep in mind. I don't know what changed, but Mindy is a far better teacher here than she ever was with Dave, and I was excited to see if she was going to develop in this aspect. But Paul quit in his first scene. No, seriously, we never see or hear about him again after this. Rightfully so, he's freaked out at the thought of dying and bails on the first chance he gets. Now, when Paul wasn't there in the present day, I thought something would happen to get him out of the picture, but this is what they went with. I fully believe now that Millar never intended to do anything with him, and it was just the illusion of world building to close out Kick-Ass 3. But even then, what a waste! If you wanted him gone, why not make a story out of it and have him killed because of Mindy? She's supposed to still only be 12 years old, so she should be making mistakes, and this relaunch was the perfect chance to reinvent her and mature a character, but that's already been scrapped in the first few pages. Her plan now is to take on the world alone, but the ghost of her father convinces her to keep looking, and it was nice to see this as a coping mechanism that stayed with her, as it wasn't fleshed out much in the original series. But am I crazy, or did she only used to call him Big Daddy if they were out in public? Just seems weird she wouldn't call him Dad. They also retcon her into being a diehard comic fan, like we knew what Dad was, but Mindy never seemed that bothered. But now she's dropping New 52 lingo, which I have to respect because, as you know, the New 52 is my jam. Even if it is a bit jarring to hear a Dave-esque line coming from Mindy, at least Millar is talking about comics instead of just lazy name dropping. And despite my reservations, I like the evolution of Mindy here. It makes me think there's no way she can be doing this just 1 month after Kick-Ass 3, but she doesn't just muscle her way through every fight against people 4 times her size. There's a better focus on weapons and gadgetry, which should have always been her thing rather than hand-to-hand combat. Admittedly, the plot isn't that complex, but each arc is only 4 issues, so it doesn't have much time to go deep. But what it does well is explore the grey area of crime that's often been missing. Mano is a mass murderer, someone Mindy should be targeting anyway, but we explore how he justifies the crimes that he does to protect his hometown and family. The conversations between him and Mindy did more character building than anything that we got with Violencia. That theme of family guides the whole of the Columbia arc, because Mindy has an oracle-like assistant called Camilla, tasked with watching over Mano and terminating him if he tries to betray Mindy. And you see, that's the type of contingency plan that makes sense to have in place. Camilla feels like a natural addition, and how Millar teased out her history was great. He brought it back to that moral ambiguity because her son was killed by Mano, and if there had been a few more issues, this could have developed more, but of course, Mano betrays Mindy. You know what? She may still be able to dodge every single bullet, but for once, her plans fall through. This is what I've wanted from a character since she was introduced. Put her in these situations she hasn't guessed would happen and show us how she adapts. It's like a chess game between her and Mano, so when she finds his brother to use as leverage, I wondered how far Mindy was willing to go in her crusade. Even the ending, where Camilla gets to confront Mano but can't pull the trigger, played out great. I enjoyed watching Mindy force Mano into certain death to resolve everything, and for the first time ever, I wanted more Hit Girl. Does it feel like it ends before it barely leaves the stalls? Yeah, but if you are sticking with her as this unstoppable force, then fun short Globetrotting adventures is the right option. The trade-off though is that there will be parts that don't get a satisfying conclusion. Camilla adopting Mano's brother was a bit of a leap, but did connect it back to that idea of family, and the rotating creative team means that even even if I don't enjoy a specific part, it won't be for long. For example, I couldn't really get on board with Ricardo Lopez Ortiz's style. It was funky and dynamic and had some of the most unique paneling and framing that I've seen in this whole journey, but often looked like a Scotty Young imitation that couldn't capture the sense we were in Colombia. Much like with Kick-Ass, I was cautiously optimistic at the idea of Millar trusting his creation with someone else. So when I saw that we were going to Canada next, with Eduardo Risso on the art and Jeff Lemire writing, I was interested. If you ask me who is the polar opposite of Millar in terms of storytelling, my first pick probably would be Lemire. He is someone who can cut right to the core of who a character is, and if he could bring a percentage of his skill from Essex County or Sweet Tooth, then there might finally be a second layer to Mindy. I find it ironic as well that the first page not written by Millar has Mindy immediately in danger because she's stuck in a bear trap. This change of scenery helped everything feel new. She's confronted with challenges she never had in New York, and nature became her biggest opponent in this arc. You've got ice, bears, and the wilderness to contend with. That left way more of an impression on me than Billy Baker and his gang that she's going after. They are responsible for shipping heroin to New York, so it still connects back to her roots, but she's not in a comfort zone. As well, her needing to be saved rather than always saving everyone else allowed her to become more vulnerable. The flashbacks with Big Daddy felt better integrated into the story because the old guy who saves her is nursing her back to health. The way Lemire used these 4 issues was far more fleshed out than a time in Colombia because we get a full story here. Honestly, when Baker's gang cornered her in the forest and we see Hit Girl stealth away through the trees, it's probably my favourite Hit Girl scene from any of the books, and reminded me of that great moment in the first movie when she saves Dave and Big Daddy. Luck doesn't play into it here, it's purely the tactics of her attack that keep her alive. Overall, the story isn't anything special, and I can't tell you anything about Billy Baker that makes him interesting, besides the fact that he's more insulted at being called a shit hockey player than he is at hearing his son has been killed. But coming from those earlier series where it felt like stuff happened purely for the shock, I'm okay with it being quite paint by numbers. I loved how it slowly revealed that the police who arrested Hit Girl were working for Baker, and meant they gave us a great conclusion that came full circle as Mindy manages to use the environment to win. Much like with the story, the art also got better the longer it went on. I like Eduardo Risso, but in some of those earlier scenes it looked more like Travel Foreman's work on Iron Fist. What did work was the vast space of the environments. Seeing Mindy in the absolute middle of nowhere changed the tone completely. There is a sense now that she's alone, which there wasn't really before, and meant I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed a different creative team taking over Millar's baby. Lemire used absolutely every page he had, so I'm glad there's continuity between these stories. Because when Raphael Scavone and Albuquerque pick up the next arc, Mindy is working for the Toronto airport security. When she crosses paths with Legate, a thief who was smuggling a jewel-encrusted skull to pay a debt back to Guestina, the old lady who's in charge of all crime in Rome. The fights in this opening issue were phenomenal. It's the one that best matched the pace of the original, and Albuquerque was easily my favourite style of the whole thing. There's energy behind everything he does, and it's great at capturing that feeling of speed or weight, and when the background does disappear, it adds to the moment rather than feeling like he wanted to cut a corner. Instead, it's the plot where corners are cut. Guestina's whole character is pretty bog standard. The only unique thing about her is that she's an old woman. Mindy is only found by Legate because she talks to a cat about a plan, and it happens to be the one cat who is recording everything and tracking her. This leads to a fight in the Colosseum, which was entertaining and a true trailer moment, but when Mindy has the upper hand and is about to kill Legate, she doesn't because Guestina is holding her dad hostage, so Mindy can't kill it because Mindy had a dad too. Oh come on, this type of thing was already a meme by 2018. You can't use the "we both have parents, get out of jail free" card and expect it to not be mocked. Billy Baker Jr, who you killed in Canada, had a dad, and probably the majority of the people that you killed did as well, so is this a rule that you have to live by moving forward, or... At least here, all the story arcs gave a better insight into how Mindy's processing the time she had with her father. So it's still weak, but the dad connection being Gatto's lifesaver makes more sense here than in other stories, and the ghost of him following her is what I'd wanted all the way back in a first spin-off. Although between the different writers, there are some glaring inconsistencies in the way their relationship is being written. When Lemire was writing, it was clear he was channeling Nick Cage's Big Daddy rather than who we got in the comics, and no one can seem to decide on if she calls him Daddy or refers to him by his superhero alias. But still, it's nice how each story arc has touched on this a bit and kept it as a fundamental part of Mindy's character, and those minor hiccups are worthy since each writer writer brings a different core element to their arc. Gangs born out of poverty, nature, and here, religion is the motivation behind the main villain. So although none of these arcs have been must-reads, I could see it being the case that two people could have completely different favourites. Without that, I don't know how much I'd have enjoyed each arc individually, because the rest of their own storyline is similar to what we've seen before. Hit Girl teams up with someone local to take down the crime boss of the city. She's even working with a criminal again like she did in Colombia. Hell, the twist is even the same. Yet despite that, I still didn't see this ending coming. Believing she saved the day, Mindy catches a flight, but security realizes Legata stole the skull back, only for it to turn out that her dad was an accomplice to tug at her heartstrings so that they could sell the skull. Sure, this is probably never going to be resolved, but for once, it's nice to end a story without Mindy being the smartest person on the planet. It helps the Rome arc to end on a high. But I told a little white lie back there, because there is one storyline within this that is a must-read. Probably more so than all the patiences if I had to choose, and that is Kevin Smith's Hit Girl in Hollywood. If I gave even the slightest impression that Smith's rallying for this to be the basis of a Hit Girl movie wasn't a great idea, then I apologise. If you have time to read only one thing after the Dave era, make sure it's this. Everything I'd wanted from the beginning was here. It's meta without that being the entire concept, there are genuinely hilarious one-liners, and the pace is so spot on that it doesn't feel like corners are caught or that it's dragged out. We open with a silent issue where Hit Girl stops a school shooting. Ironic considering this is the only arc set in America and this is the very first thing that happens. And without a single line of dialogue or narration, we're still told everything that we need. She stumbles on a book in the library, an unofficial biography of her life that's soon to be a big Hollywood movie, with Mindy being played by Juniper Florence, America's newest sweetheart who is committed to taking the role as seriously as possible. Mindy infiltrates the production and is annoyed by all the inaccuracies of her life, which conveniently looks like Matthew Vaughn's first movie. To get her revenge, she targets the head of the studio, Lou Rothstein, a man who takes every chance he can get to abuse his power with young women. Thank God this is all fiction. However, Mindy's too late, as Lou has already been mutilated by the Dictator and the super agent. Hit Girl's framed for the attack and catches a stray bullet as she escapes, and much like with Patience, the part I love most was seeing what happened when the plan failed. Mindy's relied on a few people so far this series, but her tracking down a pediatrician was that nice middle ground of her getting herself out of the situation, but knowing that she needs help. For as much as I enjoyed the story, I had a love-hate relationship with the art though. Orum? I have no idea if I'm saying that right. Look at this. A letter is crossed out. Do I have to pronounce that? I don't know, but her style was clean and had that Hollywood bright sheen to it that suits this storyline. But sometimes it was a bit too Disney, or like those made-for-kids superhero books, especially when it tackles serious topics like school shootings, but she still told the story well through her art. One thing she did amazingly was the homages, and I'm talking the Dark Knight Returns one in particular because it wasn't just name-dropping, but respecting comics as a whole, and this should have been what Kick-Ass did from issue 1. In fact, it even homages Kick-Ass by bringing back the Gina Vessi connection. I really wasn't expecting this, but since it's been a while, I was pleasantly surprised when Frank Genovese hears about Hit Girl targeting Hollywood and wants revenge for Chris, Rocco, Ralphie, and pretty much his whole family. Honestly, there's not much I disliked about this. Juniper turning out to be behind Lou's mauling because she's a method actor is one of the funniest things I've read in a good long while, and probably makes her the most unique villain in the entirety of the Kick-Ass lore. But the fact she teamed up with Mindy to take down the remaining Genoveses was great. All the action felt tense and integral to the plot, and the way it incorporated Hollywood everywhere it could is what this spin-off promised from the beginning, and was done far better than any of the other creative duos. So please, if you read Kick-Ass and nothing else, at least read Hit Girl in Hollywood. Now, how nice would it be if that was the end of this section? End on a high and stroll right into Kick-Ass vs Hit Girl, but there is still 2 chapters to go, and honestly, it was hard to care after it had already peaked. Hollywood had been so good that by the time Mindy had landed in Hong Kong, I was out of steam. Being real, it was more jarring than anything because Daniel Way had Mindy over-narrating and made her deeply philosophical, which has never been the character. With the way release schedules are, I'm not sure how much each writer knew about the arc before or after it, but there are often bizarre overlaps that end up feeling derivative because of this approach. Boss Lou is the antagonist of Hong Kong, and the fact she wants to cut dicks off would be interesting if there wasn't already a character in Hollywood called the Dictator, because that pun alone gives it the win every time. And both Hong Kong Kong and the closing arc India have the same problem in that it tries to cram too much story in and doesn't develop what is there. The plot is pretty much the same in both books. Mindy goes to the city to take down the crime boss, and in both stories she works with homeless kids. Again, weird coincidence. But because of the amount of story attempted here that isn't developed, the emotional notes it tries to hit are missing. The homeless gang of Hong Kong are integral to Mindy beating Boss Lou, and some of them become collateral damage in Mindy's war. The leader sells Hit Girl out, and it even touches on corruption within the police force, but none of it is established enough for the reveal to pack a punch. There are literally characters that die in the scene after they're introduced, but we have to sit through the rest of the group crying about someone I ain't even learned the name of. Even if I felt the series had overstayed its welcome, I still persevered with the Hong Kong arc because I knew this was where it would link back up with Patience's story. Except it doesn't. There is not a single mention of New Mexico, the cartel, or Kick-Ass. So, do you remember how I only read this to see how it connected back? Well, there was no point to that. This was the moment that ruined the illusion for me, that we had been building to a big crossover since both books had launched at the same time, because now, that effort was clearly one-sided. So I guess I'm just grateful there were some entertaining stories along the way. Unfortunately though, Hit Girl in India was not one of those. For anybody who's been wishing I'd just crack on with this video a bit, that's about to be granted. I do give this one the benefit of the doubt because it's Peter Milligan. He's done some great work over the years, but I could not get invested with this final arc. I want to just say it's because I was burnt out with Hit Girl's shtick, but the formula was so obvious that I knew what would happen before I read it. Because of that, this first issue felt longer than the entirety of Hollywood, Rome, Canada, and Colombia combined. The criminal mastermind is called the Beggar Man, who targets the kids on the streets of Mumbai, and you know exactly how that will play out, but where this fully lost me was when he introduced a weird, overly convoluted subplot about BBC Worldwide. I spoke about the theme of each arc earlier, and the media could have been an interesting one that also touched on what Kick-Ass originally wanted to, and sometimes the secondary story can redeem a poor main one, but this didn't. A conspiracy involving the news station is just putting lipstick on a pig. It doesn't change the fact that it's a pig. I think I skim-read the final 2 issues, and if it wasn't for Ram, the begging child who asked Mindy to train him and bring that idea full circle, I don't think I could tell you anything interesting about it. So for as much as I said Hit Girl in Hollywood is a must-read, I implore you to stop after that, especially if you're like me and hoping this is a warm-up for the Kick-Ass vs Hit Girl crossover because it acts like it doesn't exist. Patience's series had the courtesy to promote, but what? Is Hit Girl in India too cool for that? Or worse, was the crossover such a last-minute thought that it wasn't even worth mentioning? This was inevitable. Although team-ups and spin-offs have been part of Dave's story, this looked like a true crossover. Until I started reading it. Niles and Fusin are back on creative duties, and if you told me this was just issue 19 of Kick-Ass, I wouldn't bat an eyelid. But that's kind of a good thing. There were a ton of unresolved story points that needed to be addressed from Patience, but barely any on the Hit Girl front. And straight away it does that by opening on Maurice's funeral. But I have to wonder, what on earth would you think is going on if you'd only followed Hit Girl? My theory that all of this was done to promote Patience goes out the window because this is labelled as issue 1 when it's actually chapter 4. Great for me because I was thoroughly shortchanged by the end of New Girl, but it does feel deceptive in the way it's initially presented. At the same time though, it's disappointing that Maurice was this big shadow over Patience's life, but his death is brushed away with a funeral and a pile of money outside Edwina's door. So we need a new villain, and we're introduced to Vasquez, who works for Cortez and is so identical to every bad guy we've seen in New Mexico that he even looks a bit like Wallace. The dissent amongst Kick-Ass's group is only getting worse, so Vasquez offers a pardon from the cartel if they can kill Kick-Ass. This betrayal's been a long time coming, and I'm glad it finally got a payoff and wasn't like the Juice's civil war in Kick-Ass 3. It ties into the morality of it all, and she couldn't just keep hoping that the criminals she works with will always agree with her. The saddest part about it is that life outside of being Kick-Ass is the best it has been in a while for Patience. She's doing well at school and finally taken Coop out of the friend zone, so it would be the perfect time to count her blessings and give up being Kick-Ass. But the betrayal weighs heavy on her, and she refuses to let this all be for nothing. Meanwhile, Hit Girl's making a beeline for New Mexico and taking out every gang member along the way, even though this does feel more like Kick-Ass featuring Hit Girl, who being this looming Terminator-like threat that's closing in on Patience is entertaining. The blending of the hyperactive Dave world and the bleak realism of Patience's is great in parts, but detrimental in others. For example, Kick-Ass is tracking a van linked to a drug deal, jumps from a rooftop without even a twisted ankle, steals a convertible, jumps from the car onto the van, which causes a huge explosion that the driver is completely oblivious to. It's the middle of the night. Did the huge flames in your mirror not catch your attention? That's just one example that felt like a betrayal of the commitment to realism that we'd seen with Patience. However, I did like seeing Hit Girl having to do recon to track down Kick-Ass. Her going through various members of the cartel restored that vigilante tone, because I honestly thought they'd just magic the information into Mindy's lap. As well, the pace is great. Their paths cross quickly enough in a believable way, but we're still given enough time with them individually to avoid it feeling like one is just waiting for the other to do something. But why on earth does Mindy immediately give up Dave's identity? Was he exposing on Twitter retconned back into continuity? I did laugh though when she asked how she got Dave's costume, like it wasn't something he just bought off the internet over 10 years ago and is probably still readily available. Also, bit hypocritical to be offended that someone would use Dave's identity when you just gave it to the first kid you found who quit after one day, and this would have been a prime opportunity to finally answer the question I've had since issue 1. Why did Patience choose Kick-Ass? But instead it just doubles down on it purely being a coincidence and that she doesn't know who the original Kick-Ass is. I'm gonna assume she was in Afghanistan at that time. One opportunity I am glad is seized is to show how unfair this matchup is. Hit Girl may have had main character plot armor this entire time where she can John Wick her way through countless unnamed cannon fodder, but that's not Patience. Let's be real, this fight shouldn't even be close. It's Patience all day every day. She is a grown-ass woman. Literally, it's still there in every panel. She's fought in wars, and there is nothing Hit Girl can do to bridge that gap in skill. And she doesn't. Niles makes a logical decision and ensures Patience wins, and I would bet my life savings that wouldn't happen if Millar was writing. It waited until the very dying breath of the entire saga, but Mindy finally met a match. If we're being realistic though, did anyone think this would be the whole storyline? When there's so many cartel guys coming after it, we're expected to believe it wouldn't be the classic case of
hashtag they punch for a bit, then they're mates.
In a way, I might have preferred that here. One of the few benefits of reading those Hit Girl stories is seeing her learn that it's okay to rely on people again, and that who she initially perceives as an enemy may actually be an ally. It's necessary too, since Patience carries the unconscious Mindy out of a burning building, only to be confronted by Vasquez. The two narrowly escape, but because the cartel is now dealing with more than just Kick-Ass, Vasquez calls him Rosa. Well, they don't even bother giving her a name, so she's Rosa 2, the next in a line of female assassins. Meanwhile, Coop drops by the diner and discovers that Patience hasn't worked there for months. Again, I went back, and the last time the diner was shown, she was working there. It genuinely feels like the diner subplot is exclusively told in a non-linear way, and considering how well Patience protected her double life, I'm surprised she didn't even have a cover story in place about the diner. Coop's gone there before, did she just think he would never go again? However, Patience is fortunate because Coop is the most patient guy on the planet. It may be her name, but it's his personality, as he confronts her with the truth and she just kisses him, which makes him okay with everything, to the point where he makes her breakfast the next day. Damn, how good was that kiss? Despite starting completely different, their relationship falls into the same rhythm as Dave and Val, with her promising that the whole Kick-Ass thing is coming to an end. She's just got one last thing she needs to do. There's a video game philosophy at play here, that because she's taken out so many of the cartel warehouses, the few remaining are more difficult as they want to protect it more, and I really like this idea, especially since Rosa 2's been called in, but I don't know if it's because there are only 5 issues, but things seem easier than ever before for Patience. She kills everyone without as much as a missed shot, so perhaps Hit Girl rubbed off on her. And it's unfortunate that Vasquez left before the bullets started flying, or else all of Patience's problems could have been solved right here. Fortunately, Hit Girl's on his tail, and either he is the slowest driver on the planet, or Patience can teleport, as this leads to a showdown in what looks like Hong Kong. This one is cut short by the police, but it's the day after the first fight, and I have no confidence Hit Girl would have won. Realistically, she should be concussed at this point, but I do like how it's building up to a big final showdown between the two, instead of copping out and making them best mates. They agree to meet at some Wild West location, which, I know Niles is American, but as a Brit, we assume every state in America has a few of these. But despite the time invested in the build-up, this wraps up far too quickly, and just like Dave's series, way too neatly. If anything, reading Hit Girl's series now worked against her because she comes across as a moron here. You're telling me she's worked with the likes of Mano and spared Legata because she has a dad, but won't even listen to Patience. Surely the smallest bit of research would show that she's not like the rest of the cartel, but Mindy is so adamant she's doing this to honor Dave's legacy because he only wore the costume to save people, which is a great bit of gaslighting to protect a guy who quit being Kick-Ass the second he saw a girl naked. Hit Girl must have learned that she can't win a fistfight against Patience, so brings all the weaponry she can. But Patience has been the character to think ahead, So when we saw her earlier at the grave of Maria, one of the side chicks who died fighting Rosa, I knew she was up to something. Using a corpse to stage a death was a very smart move and one that I didn't see coming. Even Mindy seemed surprised she'd won so easily, and considering that Patience's battle has always been against the cartel, it's a wise move to go in this direction because in a sense, both of them win. What I was disappointed with is literally every other storyline. After faking a death, Patience makes a beeline for Cortez, who apparently has absolutely no security, as she walks right up to him and cuts his throat, which apparently brings an end to the cartel, as if the last few times this already happened, there wasn't already someone ready to replace the leader. It reminded me of how lazily Maurice was taken care of, and it's as if Niles remembered how poorly he concluded New Girl, so thought a rushed ending for everything was better than not doing one at all. Patience and Cooper all good, with her never having to reveal its secret, Frankie dropped the assault charges, and she graduated. All within the same scene. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad she got a happy ending because she's easily been one of my favourite characters, but it just proved there was a lot thrown at the wall that was never properly explored. In an uncanny way, the parallels between Patience's story and Dave's epitomises what the hell happened to Kick-Ass. A strong opening with pretty decent sales numbers, a good story with the odd occasional burst of new energy, followed by a gradual decline in commitment to the concept that comes across as a dwindling passion until we're met with a rushed and disappointing conclusion. Although there's no way that was intentional, surely it can't just be a coincidence, and perhaps signifies that what the hell happened to Kick-Ass is that it was a concept never meant for longevity in the first place. And through Dave, Patience, and to some extent Mindy, we've seen that happen multiple times now. Hell, if we're really looking for comparisons, there's even a tease to close out the story. Having retired, Patience puts the Kick-Ass costume on eBay, with someone buying it immediately. And I know what you're thinking, $300? Why not just buy the ski suit from wherever Patience and Dave got it? And is she drop shipping this, or will her address just be there on the return? But much like Millar said back in 2018, Kick-Ass is a mantle that's supposed to be passed down, so who knows when we might see this mysterious person next? What's that? Come on, be serious, that wasn't Dave. Just look at those dainty hands and that skyline that could have very easily just been any city on the planet. Are you sure? Dave's story isn't over? Well, if we're to truly understand what the hell happened to Kick-Ass, then I guess it makes sense that we catch back up with the guy who started this whole thing off, and see what happens when he comes back for one last time as part of Millar's endgame. I mean, big game. It's fitting that the final part of this journey brings us back to the story that I felt influenced a lot of the early Kick-Ass creation, Wanted, a title that retroactively became the inception point for Millarworld. So in 2023, for the 20th anniversary, and with pretty much all of the Millarworld books owned by Netflix, Millar launched Big Game, the multiversal epic where over 20 of his creator-owned properties crossed over, for 5 issues. It's interesting, no doubt about it, and in the same way that Kick-Ass has done a lot of these tentpoles for a comic property, what was left on the bucket list besides an event? We open in 1986, when the final battle between good vs evil took place and the villains won. Heroes were turned into comics so that no one would ever know what really happened. And during the events of Wanted, Wesley Gibson stepped up to become the leader of the fraternity of supervillains. Now, I reread Wanted to get the full experience, and there was quite a bit of retconning done to get Big Game where it needed to be. Firstly, Wesley doesn't look like Eminem anymore. He was also really sadistic in that book too, like the guy admitted to raping and murdering innocent people, and I have no idea how he was ever supposed to be a main character that we'd want to follow. Like, I read this when I was 14 and I thought it was great, but is Wanted just a bad book? However, despite making the world a worse place from the shadows, heroes have been cropping up again, something that started with Kick-Ass, and Wesley recruits Nemesis to kill them all before another war begins. There's more than enough super teams that could put up a fight, but unfortunately, none of them want Dave Lizewski. He's a 30-something burnout that bounced from job to job, and unable to capture the same high he felt when he was Kick-Ass. The world has changed since he retired, and can't help but feel responsible for every other hero that's risen up since. This is a great reintroduction, and if you don't like this, Millar bizarrely introduces him again in issue 3. I don't want to say it's relatable, but a loser in his 30s in a dead-end job that's still delusionally trying to chase his teenage dream. Yeah. The regret he feels over retiring haunts him every day, especially as he sees Wesley targeting the very heroes he felt he inspired. And when the president makes an emergency broadcast calling for help, Dave puts on the costume for the first time in 10 years. There are a lot of Dark Knight Returns parallels here, but it doesn't feel lazy because of the world he's in. It is a bit self-centered to think every hero on the planet only exists because of Dave, like, He was never really that good or inspiring, but it's easy to empathise with him. The older we get, the more regret and what ifs we have, and seeing the world change around him would weigh heavy on him. I really like that he's still with Val since she was the main reason he gave up on Kick-Ass in the first place. So at least it wasn't all for nothing, but I still can't stand their dialogue. When he's leaving, he tells her to think about Batman, and now this whole thing is like Crisis on Infinite Earths or a big Marvel summer event, and who would talk like that in this situation? If I was going off to the army for a war and might die, I wouldn't tell my missus that the world is doing a Platoon or a Saving Private Ryan. As well, it was annoying in his original series, but in this context, it raises quite the conundrum, one that leads me to believe this shared universe was never Millar's plan. From a story perspective, why wouldn't Wesley have killed Dave back in 2008 when he first went viral? That was years after Wanted, and he clearly had the ability. Are you telling me that Hit Girl and Big Daddy could track Dave down to his house but not the fraternity? They could have blown up the entire apartment building and gotten away with it, so why let this slip by? Why not intervene during the Battle of Times Square? Surely that was something they heard about. But beyond that, how can DC and Marvel exist in this world? Big Game doubled down on the lore of Wanted, that all fictional superheroes within that world were real people that had been killed in 1986, which is a clear reference to the time comics took a darker tone in our world, so the parallel is obvious. Dave frequently mentions the likes of Batman, Superman, the X-Men, Spider-Man, and even Scarlet Witch, so by the very logic of this book, they must have existed but all were killed by Wesley Gibson's dad. Firstly, that just wouldn't happen. The fraternity have never shown enough strength to take out all the heroes of either Marvel or DC, let alone both. Or is there a separate division of heroes that only ever existed in the comics but Dave never referenced any of these? Because that sounds really messy. And secondly, there is no way that Wanted and Kick-Ass were set in the same world, since not one person in Wesley Gibson's original story even mentioned an established hero. Are you telling me that Wesley learns about all of this and doesn't even bother asking in passing if that means that they killed Captain America or Green Lantern? And more than anything, I refuse to accept that anyone from the big two would be taken out by a guy so lazy that his supervillain name is the Killer. What, was the bad guy already taken? If this wasn't just a last minute decision to make this a shared universe, surely Millar must have known that's what he was effectively saying with how frequently Dave makes references to heroes outside of Millar World. It probably could have been explored, but for some baffling reason, this culmination of over 20 titles has the same number of issues as Hit Girl's first standalone series. So there are far too many characters to juggle here, and as a result it fails to truly pay enough attention to any of them. Even smaller cliffhangers like if Dave was the one who brought Patience's costume, or even if he had any thoughts about there being a Kick-Ass in New Mexico were never touched on. So to make this as smooth as possible, I'm not going to get into the storyline with the Chrononauts, the Ambassadors, or any of the others unless it plays directly into the Kick-Ass part, but honestly, Dave is an afterthought. And the punchline. In the battle against the fraternity, all the heroes meet on a battleship as per the President's orders. Todd, Marty, and the surviving members of Justice Forever made it there, but Dave missed the boss. He's still a complete pushover, and considering he got chased off by a bunch of teens, he's regressed from the Dave that we left at the end of Kick-Ass 3. Had there been more time, Millar could have explored that jarring reality check of being an adult, or that realization that we aren't as invincible as we thought we were. But instead, it's only because he's so incompetent that he isn't killed, because the obvious trap turns out to be a trap so that Nemesis can kill everyone without having to travel. It's like Millar forgot where he'd left Dave, but one character he hasn't forgotten how to write is Mindy. She's finally aged beyond 12 and is living in Michigan when she becomes Wesley's next target. They're taking no chances and position long-range snipers at the 4 nearest comic shops because now this is the biggest part of her personality. And just as she's about to turn a corner, she's intercepted by Eggsy. This was a fun mini crossover that I didn't expect, and having Hit Girl transition into more of a spy than a vigilante was a move that I never realised I'd wanted until now, and still want because it lasted all of half an issue before Eggsy is killed. But Hit Girl plot armors her way out of it and travels back in time to the Jurassic era, and honestly, with Millar writing, Mindy's a bigger threat to the dinosaurs than that asteroid. She stumbles into the Empress universe, but most of this was jargon to me because that's one of the Millar World books I've not read yet, and I admire it to a degree, but it's baffling how confident it is that you've read MPH, Hook, Empress, and a dozen or so other forgettable titles so that you can keep up with where this is going. Imagine if when you watch Avengers Doomsday, it turns out that Agatha all along is as integral as Fantastic Four. And I have to say, I know there was a dump of references in the dying pages of Kick-Ass 3, but I'm just not buying this shared universe at all. And the way it's played out has me thinking this was just an advert for Millar World books rather than a story told with them. I've used the word gaslighting a few times in this video, but fuck it, everyone else uses it wrong on a daily basis, but that's how how it felt whilst I was reading this, as if it was gaslighting me into believing that these always coexisted, despite the very obvious plot holes that would create. I'd have given this a pass if it went down the Secret Wars route of confirming they were separate worlds but got merged together for this event. But don't bullshit me to save the legwork. You can't just bundle a few random properties together and pass it off as a shared universe, especially not in 2023 when we were already bored by this with multiple attempts that had already failed. And yeah, I'm looking at you, Dark Universe. This even tries to steal the big Avengers Assemble Endgame moment, and it's so blatant that Dave doesn't call it out in the hopes that you don't notice. Of course that can only happen because of Mindy, the queen of the entire Millar world, because she steals a time machine from the Empress Empire, immediately knows how it works, and goes back to before everyone was killed by Nemesis, which allows the Resistance to rise up when the Fraternity launches its final attack. However, Dave can only watch from the sidelines because he still missed that boss, but the Magic Order seek him out to reassure him of his place in the world, which is nice, even if it does also sound like they're blaming him for the battle that's currently going on. You know what though, this was a touching moment whilst the battle becomes a backdrop, and the voice of Dave was still there, so it was great seeing him convince the Order to get involved. With their magic, they summon all the heroes killed in 1986 back to life, with the likes of Jupiter's Legacy and Superior entering the mix. But due to rights reasons, no one from Marvel, DC, or any of the other heroes Dave frequently mentioned are able to appear. So is it just that some comic characters were killed by the Fraternity, but there are also entirely fictional heroes as well? This has confused me for long enough now. Having already bent the rules, Cordelia Moonstone grants Dave superpowers so that he can join the fight. And this was a really nice touch, until I realised it was the absolute last thing that should have ever happened to Dave. Kick-Ass was about an average teenager becoming a vigilante in the real world. There were some elements that required us to suspend our disbelief, but never towards the fantastical. He got beaten, stabbed, and couldn't even jump across a roof, yet now he can fly? For as fun as it may be, I can't ignore that it's everything Millar was trying to reject with the original story back in 2008. It's one of the biggest comic examples I can remember of jumping the shark, of sacrificing what had been built for years for a quick moment of fan service. It's one of those don't think about it and you'll enjoy it ideas that feels cheap once you look past what's on the page. Might sound overdramatic, but having read everything Kick-Ass in the build up to this, Dave getting superpowers signified Millar fully giving up on his original idea, which is more disappointing than if he'd just left Dave with Kick-Ass 3. It would have meant more if Dave and Mindy had at least one page together, or a panel even. That would have been more satisfying fan service, but the two are at the exact same battle and never even share a hello. Because Mindy's going right to the source, Wesley Gibson, as of course she's the only person in this entire multiverse that can stop the leader of all evil in this world and, oh. You know, it's ironic how this entire time I've wanted Mindy to be able to meet a match, to realise that she's not this unstoppable force, and honestly, there have been a lot of times that I wish one of the writers had the balls to kill her, but sometimes the worst thing you can get is the thing that you want, because now that it's real, why did I want this? She was just a kid, a fearless 12-year-old that was taking on the world, and without her, what are we left with? Evil? A sadistic fraternity led by one of the worst people in all of comics? Is that really better than a world where a 12-year-old could do the unbelievable? She may have broke the concept with her existence, but now that she's gone, the only thing that's broken is my heart. Wait, what? You are kidding me? She's still alive? And is the one to kill Wesley? I take it back. Please give me the thing I wanted. I don't want this bullshit. The kid who was trained by her dad? Who he himself was just a comic fan with no professional training, she's the only one who's able to get the upper hand on the overarching villain of the entire universe? Of course she does. It was dumb of me to wonder why Wesley didn't kill Dave in 2008, because he probably knew that Mindy would take him out. It's my fault for not expecting her to become the master of time travel so that two of her could exist at the same time. Of all the disappointing rushed conclusions I've been subjected to in this Kick-Ass journey, this one takes the cake, because not only is the war just immediately over after this as if there wasn't an entire army out there, but we don't even see Hit Girl again. She just kills the bad guy, makes a sarcastic comment, and that's it. I don't care if the two reviews on Wikipedia did give this a 9 out of 10. There is no way you can consider this a satisfying ending. They do give Dave a conclusion where his ambition to be a hero is commended, and he becomes the new ambassador for America. In the context of Big Game, I guess it is nice because he wasn't getting any responses at the start, and he has always wanted to be a hero, but if we boil it down, this has the same effect as him joining the NYPD at the end of Kick-Ass 3. What about Val? Was she just okay with him going back on his promise? Does Dave having powers change their relationship at all? Well, if you gave even the slightest shit about that, then you will be disappointed. Because of this, and the fact I assume Mindy will go off on more adventures as Hit Girl, I can honestly say that Big Game didn't do much to progress either of them. If you just want a big dumb fun collage of Millar's creator-owned titles, then this will scratch that itch, and the more of his series you've read, the better. But if you're wanting anything meaningful from the Kick-Ass storyline, then you will be disappointed, because all you will get here is Dave being used as a glorified signpost to prop up some of the lesser known titles, and the same Mindy God mode bullshit that we've been dealing with since 2008. It's ironic. This entire time I've been wondering what the hell happened to Kick-Ass, but now that I'm at the end, I'm asking that same question, but for a different reason. When I started this video, I'd only intended to read the Dave Lizewski years of Kick-Ass to try and understand how this brand went from such an initial boom all the way to fading into obscurity. But the more I looked into it, I became fascinated to see that this character had never been abandoned but misguided. So what caused this decline? What prevented Kick-Ass from being a modern staple similar to the likes of Spawn, Hellboy or Invincible? Going into it, I had every belief that Kick-Ass was likely just a flash-in-the-pan success, that the idea fueled the initial hype, but the story itself couldn't carry it much beyond that. The news of it getting a movie before it was ever published, and that itself being a hit, gave this series every chance it could possibly have to be the next big thing. So then I wondered if Kick-Ass was maybe a victim of its own success. I'm glad I looked at the film duology, because the popularity of Hit Girl clearly seeped into the comic to the point where she became more of a main character than Dave. But I still can't confidently say that that caused a decline in popularity. It's just evidence that trying to satisfy the movie world through the comic wasn't the way to take Kick-Ass to the next level. In an odd way, the story of Dave Lizewski is a microcosm of the Kick-Ass series, a hopeful, ambitious underdog that became an instant viral success. But the bigger it tried to become, the harder it had to fight for relevance, and end up leaving behind the thing that made it original in the first place. The most interesting discovery I made was that any drop in popularity wasn't because of Millar's lack of trying. Normally, a character disappears when the creator stops caring, but from the Patience Lee saga and Hit Girl in Hollywood, it's clear that there was still potential, but it could never translate those moments into long-lasting success. So if there was still passion and fun storytelling after the initial run, perhaps Kick-Ass should have just been a limited series. Not everything needs a sequel, but success out of the gates can make a creator feel compelled to capitalize on that, rather than try to build something else from the ground up. Millar had tasted success where wanted, but had left the series at 6 issues by the time the movie had come out, and perhaps didn't want to look a gift horse in the mouth twice. Then when a third movie didn't manifest, the wind might have been taken out of his sails. I think the real answer lies somewhere between external pressure and a lack of commitment to the original concept. Although, there's still that feeling I can't shake that the real curse was in how it presented itself as ahead of its time. As now, in the modern day, it feels dated. The references haven't aged well, and the self-deprecating narrator is an overused trope, and meta-narratives are a dime a dozen. But back in 2008, there weren't many comics that were doing that. The problem with being ahead of the time is that when that's your unique selling point, you have to keep being ahead of the time. So when sequels did come out, the industry had caught up to what Kick-Ass was doing, and the story alone wasn't unique enough to help it stand out. There was an interesting trend in sales that could help support this theory, since the first issues of all 3 Dave-led Kick-Ass titles had huge sales, perhaps fueled by an interest in seeing how Millar planned to reinvent the wheel. But with each subsequent series, the final issue had fewer sales than the conclusion of the previous one. Sure, the delays between issues couldn't have helped, but it does suggest that fewer people were sticking with Kick-Ass until the end, despite being initially curious. And I felt that whilst reading, that the reliance on social media, technology, and a commitment to realistic consequences faded the longer it went on, and lost the X factor that made it stand out on launch. So what can you do when that happens, but you still feel like there's a story left to tell? Like we've seen with many of the most prolific comic characters, you pass the mantle, you explore sidekicks, and when there's nothing else left, you betray the concept and journey into the absurd. That's what we were given with Big Game, where Dave and Mindy completely jumped the shark and became caricatures of who they once were. Is it so different from Dr. Manhattan becoming the creator of the New 52, Captain America saying Hail Hydra, or Conan the Barbarian joining the Savage Avengers? Those are similar situations that feel insane to think of when you remember where they originally started. But in all of those examples, it was never the original creator that put those characters into such bizarre scenarios. But that is what happened to Dave, and there is no explanation on this planet that will lead me to believe that this was Millar's Millar's plan from the beginning. Giving Dave powers was the ultimate symbol that Millar had given up on what Kick-Ass was meant to be, so perhaps there was nothing Millar could do to make Kick-Ass a timeless icon. Instead, much like what I personally discovered were wanted, the audience that originally resonated with Kick-Ass grew up, and unfortunately the series didn't mature with them. There are many possible reasons why Kick-Ass isn't the powerhouse it was during the early days, but one interesting point I left out was the closing note from Millar at the end of Kick-Ass 3. Millar revealed here that Kick-Ass never started with Dave, but instead was meant to be a 4-issue miniseries about Big Daddy and Hit Girl that then evolved. Now, an initial concept can vary drastically from the final product, like, I thought this video was only going to be an hour, but considering how quickly all the focus shifted to Mindy, and how Dave became the comic relief in his own title, maybe the downfall of Kick-Ass was due to the fact that it kept getting distracted, and it refused to commit to one direction. If that's the case, then perhaps it is better to leave Kick-Ass with the shallow ending that we got in Big Game, and quietly hope that Stunt Nuts Does School Fight doesn't see the light of day. Then I could comfortably leave this video believing that what the hell happened to Kick-Ass is that it's a classic case of it being a victim of its own success. And sometimes with situations like that, the best thing that we can do is leave it be, and hope that the standout moments of the series get a second life when they're not overshadowed by what came after. Although, if Millar is to be believed, his proposed 5-year life cycle means that Kick-Ass is always destined to come back, in one way or another. Okay, that's the end of the video, and if you stuck around this long, then thank you. It's taken way longer than I expected, but I've really enjoyed doing this deep dive, and finding out things about Kick-Ass that I never knew before. So if you enjoyed it, please make sure that you let me know, and until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof. See you the next video.